The night stretched endlessly, a velvet canopy dotted with countless points of light that shimmered in silence. There was no sound except the occasional rustle of leaves, the distant crackle of a dying fire, and the steady rhythm of breath from those who slept nearby. The stars hung there, cold and untouchable, yet impossibly close in their brilliance, like tiny lanterns scattered across an infinite darkness. For most of the tribe, these pinpricks of light were simply part of the background of the world, beautiful perhaps, but dangerous and distant, belonging to a realm beyond their immediate understanding. Yet, for a single pair of wide, curious eyes, the night sky was different, it was alive. The child lay on the edge of the sleeping circle, head tilted back, staring upwards. There was no fear, only wonder, a deep, unshakable fascination. Unlike the others, who thought of the dark as something to endure, the child found comfort in it. The stars seemed to speak in a language that the child instinctively understood, though not with words, only with rhythm and pattern, with glimmers of light that danced as if in time with some secret music of the universe. Each point of light was a mystery, a question waiting to be answered, and though the child could not yet name them, a quiet sense of recognition stirred, a sense that these lights were not mere decoration, but something meaningful, something that could one day belong to human imagination. Around the fire, the adults huddled together, their faces etched with the lines of survival, hunger, cold, vigilance. Their eyes occasionally flicked upwards, wary of the dark, of predators, of spirits, and of the unknown. To them, the stars were indifferent witnesses to human struggle. They did not pause to marvel, for life demanded attention elsewhere, on the hunt, on the gathering of food, on the safety of the tribe. But the child had no such concerns yet. There was no worry for tomorrow, no calculation of resources, no thought of danger. Only the sky, only the soft hum of the universe, only the shimmering lights that seemed to pulse in rhythm with the beating of the child's heart. The child's mind, untrained and unburdened by the weight of adult responsibility, began to wander along invisible threads connecting one star to another. There was no conscious plan, only a sense of pattern, an innate recognition of repetition and relation. One cluster flickered more brightly than another, and the child felt the first stirrings of imagination. What if these lights were not random? What if each had a story, a character, a name? And yet, the mind recoiled slightly, instinctively cautious. After all, to assign meaning to the sky was a daring act. It was as though the child were standing at the edge of a cliff, peering into an abyss of infinity and wondering whether a single word, a single thought, could bridge the gap between the human world and the cosmos. Time passed differently under the night sky. Minutes stretched into hours, and the quiet of the darkness pressed in, sharpening every sensation. The cool wind against skin, the faint scent of smoke from the fire, the distant cry of an animal in the forest, all of it became part of a larger tapestry. The stars did not merely hang in space, they began to pulse with significance. The child noticed patterns. One star seemed to always follow another, a small group shifted imperceptibly over the nights, there was rhythm in the chaos, order hidden in the apparent randomness. The realization was subtle but profound, the universe was not indifferent, at least not entirely, and humans had the capacity to perceive, to connect, to understand. In these first moments of attention, a seed was planted. It was not yet language, not yet myth, not yet story. It was something more fundamental, recognition. A flicker of consciousness that said, this is not just sky. This is something I can know, something I can feel, something that belongs to me as much as it belongs to the night. The child could not articulate it, for words had not yet formed to capture such enormity, but the feeling was undeniable. It was awe, pure and unfiltered, a direct communion with the infinite, a quiet, unspoken dialogue between human and cosmos. And as the first night deepened, and the tribe's fire dwindled to glowing embers, the child remained there, lying on the cold earth, staring into the heavens. It was a beginning of sorts, though no one yet understood it. A beginning not marked by ceremony or ritual, not by instruction or tradition, but by a small, solitary mind daring to notice, daring to wonder, daring to believe that the stars, like people, could one day be known, named, and remembered. In that fragile stillness, the universe seemed to lean closer, as if curious too, and the child felt, for the first time, the quiet, electric thrill of discovery. The child's fascination with the stars was unlike anything seen in the tribe before. While others had long accepted the night sky as a distant, untouchable realm, this young mind approached it with relentless curiosity. There was a kind of urgency in the way the child watched, as if each flicker of light held a secret meant to be discovered before dawn. Fingers traced invisible lines in the air, connecting clusters of stars in patterns no one else could see. The other children were asleep, their small bodies curled against the cold earth, dreaming of nothing more than warmth and comfort. But the child was awake, wide-eyed, heart quickened by the immensity above. Every star seemed to whisper, beckoning, inviting a name, a recognition, a story. Unlike adults, who measured the world in terms of survival and practicality, the child's perception was unburdened by rules or expectations. Hunger and fear existed, certainly, but they were distant, secondary concerns, momentarily suspended by the allure of wonder. The mind of a child has a peculiar elasticity, capable of bending reality into shapes that the rigid minds of adults cannot fathom. Tonight, the child's mind was bending toward the stars, stretching imagination to its limits, forming connections and possibilities that no one else in the tribe could yet conceive. There was no fear of error here, only the boldness of first thought, the courage of noticing. The child's gaze shifted repeatedly, from one brilliant pinprick to another, searching for constancy and change, for meaning and rhythm. There was a pattern, subtle yet undeniable. One star would rise before the others, always tracing the same path across the sky. Another seemed to linger, as if hesitant to follow the natural order. The child's mind hummed with questions. Why do some stars move while others stay? Why does one cluster shine brighter than the rest? And above all, what stories might these silent lights hold? This was not merely curiosity, it was the first spark of abstraction, the first conscious attempt to organize the world into a framework that could be understood, remembered, and shared. It was in this quiet focus that the child began to imagine. Shapes formed in the mind's eye, a great beast prowling across the night, a bird in flight, a distant ancestor gazing down. Each cluster became a figure, each flicker a character in a story yet unwritten. The child's imagination was not random, it was anchored in the familiar, shaped by the immediate world, animals seen during the day, elders' stories half heard by the fire, the rhythm of seasons and migration, the quiet mysteries of the forest. These impressions were translated into celestial symbols, a mental map that bridged earth and sky. In this moment, the child was both artist and astronomer, poet and philosopher, shaping reality through perception and creative thought. The tribe remained unaware, wrapped in sleep or in conversations hushed around the dying embers of the fire. The adults, preoccupied with survival, could not yet comprehend the significance of the child's attention. Naming stars was not a concern of hunters or gatherers, it was irrelevant to the pressing realities of life, finding food, avoiding predators, and protecting the young. Yet the child's mind was unconstrained by these urgencies. In a sense, the child was the first bridge between instinct and intellect, between survival and understanding, between the immediacy of life and the abstraction of the cosmos. Curiosity, however, is not without its tension. The child felt both exhilaration and apprehension. There was a tiny voice of doubt. What if these patterns were illusions, tricks of the mind or the eyes? What if naming, imagining, or thinking too boldly could invoke danger, unseen forces, or the anger of spirits? Yet the thrill of discovery outweighed caution. Each small triumph, the recognition of a pattern, the formation of an imagined figure, was met with a rush of joy, a heartbeat quickened by the exhilaration of insight. The night became a teacher, patient and silent, guiding the child through the first lessons of observation and reflection. As the hours passed, the child experimented with ways to make sense of the patterns. Lines were traced in the air, connecting points of light into shapes, forming clusters that resembled animals, familiar landmarks, or imagined ancestors. Each shape was a small act of creation, a mental gesture that transformed the raw, indifferent cosmos into a canvas of meaning. In these moments, the child was performing the very first act of symbolic thought, something that would eventually define humanity itself. These connections, fragile and tentative, were not yet language, not yet myth, but they were the seedlings from which both would grow. By the time the first hints of dawn began to bleach the horizon, the child's small hands and body were stiff with cold, but the mind remained alight with possibility. The patterns persisted, shifting subtly with the movement of the stars, yet stable enough to promise recognition, understanding, and memory. The child knew, in a deep, instinctive way, that these lights could be returned to again and again, revisited like friends, chronicled, and perhaps shared. It was a revelation without words, a truth sensed through the marrow. The universe was vast, yes, but it was approachable, intimate, and capable of being known, at least in part. Even as the first light of the sun touched the horizon, the child's attention lingered, a soft ache of reluctance to leave the sky behind. Others began to stir, yawning, shaking off sleep, and preparing for the day. The child joined them, but something had changed forever. The world was no longer only earth and fire, survival and necessity. There was now the sky, there was wonder, there was the possibility of meaning beyond immediate needs. Something intangible had been glimpsed, a thread connecting the human mind to the stars above, to imagination, to understanding. And so the child's quiet vigil under the night sky became the first act of recognition in a journey that would span generations. It was a beginning that was invisible to anyone but the observer, yet monumental in its implications. It was the first whisper of humanity's fascination with the cosmos, the first spark of insight, the seed of wonder that would one day grow into story, song, myth, and science. The child, unknowing, had taken the first step in a journey that would lead humanity from silent starlight to names, to understanding, and ultimately, to the eternal dance of comprehension and curiosity that defines the human spirit. Life in the child's world was a delicate balance between survival and the rhythms of nature. The tribe moved in cycles, dictated by the seasons, the availability of food, and the migration of animals. The sun marked time, the moon marked change, and the earth itself dictated where and how the people could live. Every action was a response to necessity, hunting, gathering, building, protecting. There was no room for idle thought, no space for philosophical wonder in the daily grind of existence. And yet, even within these constraints, the seeds of imagination and reflection quietly sprouted, like tiny shoots breaking through stone. The child, standing at the threshold of awareness, was beginning to notice these sprouts, even if the rest of the tribe remained absorbed in the tangible, immediate world around them. The tribe had no written language. Communication was oral, gestures and sounds conveying instruction, warning, and story. Knowledge was preserved through memory, through repetition, and through the subtle rhythms of shared life. Elders taught the young how to track animals, identify plants, and read the weather, while children learned through imitation and play. Yet there were limits to what could be transmitted. Much of the world remained unspoken, unexamined, understood only through instinct or direct experience. In this environment, the child's fascination with the stars was exceptional. It was curiosity untethered by immediate utility, a spark of imagination daring to venture beyond the tribe's routine understanding. The physical world itself was both teacher and challenge. Forests and plains stretched endlessly, dotted with rivers and mountains that dictated movement and opportunity. Animals roamed freely, predators lurked in the shadows, and the weather could turn suddenly, bringing cold, rain, or fire. Life demanded attention, vigilance, and quick thinking. The child had grown accustomed to these demands, learning to move silently, to observe keenly, to listen to every rustle and snap. Yet the stars were not part of this survival calculus. They were distant, silent, eternal, or so they seemed. Observing them required patience, imagination, and a willingness to pause, qualities rare in a world defined by urgency. The tribe's social structure was practical and hierarchical. Elders led hunts and decisions, the strongest protected the weak, and knowledge was respected when it contributed to the tribe's continuity. Stories were told around the fire at night, often recounting past struggles, animal behavior, or moral lessons. Myth and reality were intertwined, with spirits and ancestors woven into explanations for natural phenomena. But even these stories did not fully capture the cosmos. The stars were acknowledged as mysterious, perhaps powerful, sometimes feared, but never intimately known or named. For most, the night sky was a backdrop to life, a canvas upon which fear and superstition painted vague and sometimes terrifying forms. Against this backdrop, the child's mind worked differently. There was no fear here, only curiosity, an unquenchable need to notice, to connect, to interpret. While the adults saw danger and routine, the child saw patterns, rhythm, and possibility. Each day, movements of the sun, shadows of trees, the migration of birds, and the cycles of moonlight informed the child's understanding of the natural world. Observing the stars at night became an extension of this learning, a continuation of noticing, pattern-seeking, and quiet reflection. It was here, in these small acts of observation, that the first steps toward symbolic thought and understanding of the cosmos began. Language, in this context, was both limitation and opportunity. Without words for abstract concepts, it was difficult to fully articulate insight or discovery. Most communication focused on the practical: follow, hunt, eat, danger. Naming the stars, or even recognizing them as entities distinct from the night itself, was beyond common comprehension. Yet the child, unburdened by expectation, began forming internal words, associations, and mental symbols. These names were not yet spoken aloud, they existed first as thoughts, private and fragile, waiting for the moment they could emerge into the tribe's collective understanding. The environment itself offered lessons. Night brought cold, wind, and danger, but also clarity and calm. Fires flickered, casting dancing shadows that mirrored the child's imagination. The distant sounds of nocturnal animals provided rhythm to thought, a backdrop against which patterns could emerge. Even the subtle changes in the sky, the rising of the moon, the shifting of stars, were teachers, offering hints at regularity, change, and constancy. Observing these phenomena required patience, attention, and sensitivity. In the act of noticing, the child was already engaging in the first form of scientific inquiry: careful observation, pattern recognition, and reflection. There was also a growing sense of personal responsibility and awareness. Though the child was young, there was recognition that the mind's attention was a precious resource, that curiosity itself could be an act of courage. To notice the stars, to imagine names and patterns, required stepping beyond the immediate, the familiar, the safe. The tribe depended on the child's physical presence and contribution, yet this mental exploration was a quiet rebellion against the strictly functional world, a rebellion not of defiance, but of instinctual wonder. In this tension between practical survival and imaginative exploration, the child's unique mind was quietly emerging. Even as the day demanded participation, gathering berries, carrying water, mimicking adults at hunting practice, the night remained an ever-present draw. The child's attention could not be fully extinguished, and thoughts of the stars followed through the daylight hours, hidden behind routine actions. There was a sense of continuity, an awareness that the night would return and that the stars would still be there, waiting, unchanged, ready to be seen anew. This awareness, rare and subtle, marked the child's mind as different, not more capable in physical terms, but more expansive in thought, reaching beyond immediate needs toward the abstract, the eternal, the reflective. It was in this balance, between duty and discovery, survival and imagination, day and night, that the child's first insights began to crystallize. Life in the tribe provided context, challenge, and grounding, while curiosity provided vision, connection, and potential. Without either, the first naming of the stars could never have occurred. It was the interplay between the tangible world and the unseen cosmos that set the stage for the emergence of abstract thought, symbolic language, and cultural memory. The stars became more than distant lights, they became a bridge between the known and the unknown, between instinct and reflection, between survival and meaning. And so, in the quiet moments between labor and rest, the child's mind wandered skyward, gathering fragments of observation, curiosity, and imagination. Life in the tribe was demanding, structured, and raw, but it was also fertile ground for wonder. Every day brought new impressions, new lessons from the environment, new rhythms of survival. Every night brought the promise of the stars, the invitation to connect the infinite to the finite, the personal to the universal. It was a delicate dance between the immediate and the eternal, and the child, unknowingly, had already begun to lead the first steps. That night, the air was unusually still. Even the wind seemed to pause, as if the world itself had been holding its breath. The fire had burned low, casting long, wavering shadows that danced across the faces of the sleeping tribe. Crickets whispered in the underbrush, and the distant hoot of an owl punctuated the darkness. It was the kind of night that drew attention to subtle things, the faint shimmer of dew, the quiet rustle of leaves, the faint heartbeat of the earth beneath bare feet. For the child, this stillness amplified perception, sharpening senses that had previously been dulled by the constant demands of survival. Every detail mattered, every flicker of light became significant. The child had rolled onto the cool ground, eyes fixed on the heavens. For hours, patterns seemed to emerge from chaos. A cluster of stars twinkled as if arranged in deliberate formation. Another shimmered more brightly, catching the child's gaze repeatedly, insisting on recognition. It was in these moments that the first stirrings of understanding emerged, the realization that the night sky was not random, but contained a rhythm, a consistency, a hidden order waiting to be noticed. The child did not yet have the words to describe it, but the mind grasped something fundamental: the universe, though immense and silent, had structure. As the child's eyes traced the paths of the stars, a strange feeling arose, a mixture of exhilaration and trepidation. What was being witnessed was beautiful, yes, but it was also vast beyond comprehension. The mind tried to reconcile the infinite with the finite, the eternal with the ephemeral. There was an instinctive awareness of scale, the stars were distant, yet the human mind was capable of noticing them, of imagining them, of connecting them in ways no other creature could. This tension between insignificance and possibility created a quiet thrill, a heartbeat of awareness that the child had never experienced before. The patterns grew clearer with prolonged attention. Stars that seemed isolated now suggested connections, as though invisible threads linked them. The child's imagination began to bridge these threads, forming shapes that resembled animals seen during the day, familiar beasts of the forest, birds in flight, or distant ancestors imagined as figures in the sky. These first mental constellations were fragile, tentative, yet exhilarating in their novelty. The child's mind was performing an act of creation, of interpretation, of symbolic thought that transcended immediate survival and ventured into the abstract. With each observation, the child's awareness expanded. It was not merely about seeing, it was about understanding, predicting, and imagining. Some stars moved slowly across the sky, others remained almost fixed, forming an underlying grid of permanence against which the moving lights could be compared. The child began to notice repetition over nights, certain clusters always appearing in the same place, their paths predictable. It was a discovery not of mathematics or science as we know it, but of intuition and perception, an early recognition of order, pattern, and causality. Yet the night also brought an undercurrent of tension. There was a quiet fear in acknowledging the immensity of the sky. It was easy to feel dwarfed, insignificant, lost. The child's heartbeat quickened not only with excitement, but with the unspoken question: what did it mean for a human to witness something so immense, so eternal, so untouchable? The vastness could be humbling, even frightening. And yet, within that tension, there was empowerment, the realization that one could notice, one could imagine, one could begin to name what others had only feared or ignored. The act of noticing evolved into a subtle dialogue with the cosmos. Each flicker, each movement, each pattern became a form of communication, albeit unspoken. The child began to respond inwardly, tracing lines and shapes in the mind's eye, forming silent interpretations that bridged earth and sky. This mental exercise was both contemplative and creative, combining observation with imagination in a manner that had no immediate necessity but immense significance. The night became a space for reflection, learning, and the first whispers of symbolic thought. Hours passed, measured not by clocks but by subtle changes, the shift of stars, the dimming of distant lights, the movement of shadows. The child's attention never wavered. Every detail was a clue, every repetition a potential insight. There was a rhythm to the night, a tempo that guided thought and perception. In this quiet, the child felt the thrill of discovery, the first taste of understanding something beyond immediate survival, something that touched both intellect and emotion. By the time the first hints of pre-dawn light began to soften the horizon, the child had formed a private map of the sky, mental constellations that connected points of light into shapes, figures, and stories. These were not yet words, not yet shared knowledge, but they were the foundation of what would one day become the human practice of naming, understanding, and interpreting the stars. It was a beginning that was invisible to all but the observer, yet monumental in its implications. As the sky slowly brightened, and the sleeping tribe began to stir, the child finally lowered the gaze, reluctant to leave the night behind. The mind was alight with possibilities, patterns, and questions. There was no sense of completion, only of continuation, the promise that the stars would return, the patterns would endure, and the mind could revisit them again. This night, quiet, still, and infinite, had planted the first seeds of comprehension, curiosity, and imagination, a beginning that would ripple across time, shaping thought, story, and culture for generations to come. The realization came slowly, like dawn creeping across the horizon of understanding. The child began to notice that certain stars repeated their patterns night after night, appearing in familiar positions, moving in consistent arcs across the sky. It was a subtle recognition, almost instinctive, yet profound in its implications. The stars were no longer merely points of light, they were individuals in a larger design, components of a cosmic pattern that could be observed, anticipated, and, perhaps one day, understood. This was the first flicker of abstraction, the mind's early attempt to impose order on chaos, to bring the unknowable into the realm of comprehension. Each movement of a star became meaningful. The child traced invisible lines connecting clusters, imagining shapes and forms that reflected life on Earth, a prowling wolf, a soaring bird, the silhouette of an ancestor whose stories had been told beside the fire. These mental constellations were fragile, ephemeral, and entirely personal, yet they carried a weight beyond their size. They were the first attempt at naming the night, at transforming the infinite into something intimate, recognizable, and human. This recognition was not born of necessity, it was born of curiosity, imagination, and a deep, intrinsic desire to connect with the universe. In observing these patterns, the child began to experiment with memory. Certain stars were brighter, easier to track, while others required careful attention to detect. The mind instinctively catalogued them, noting which clusters moved together and which remained separate. These were the first steps toward systematic observation, a precursor to the methods of astronomy and science that would emerge millennia later. Yet in this prehistoric moment, it was not study for utility, but study for wonder. The child was learning to see, to notice, and to relate, forming the mental scaffolding for names, stories, and comprehension. There was also an emotional dimension to this recognition. Observing constancy in the sky instilled a subtle sense of security, a feeling that the world was ordered even when the tribe's life on Earth remained uncertain. Nights could be dark and dangerous, yet the recurring patterns of stars offered reassurance. They were reliable, predictable, eternal. The child sensed that there was meaning embedded in this order, something to be understood and perhaps shared, a bridge between human perception and the vast cosmos above. This emotional resonance deepened the connection, making the act of observation both intellectual and profoundly human. Yet alongside exhilaration and wonder, there was tension. To notice, to recognize, to imagine, required stepping beyond the ordinary, beyond what the tribe considered necessary or safe. It required daring to pay attention to the abstract, the distant, the intangible. The child's awareness of this tension was instinctive. There was thrill and discovery, yes, but also a tiny undercurrent of fear that the unknown could be dangerous, that curiosity might challenge accepted norms, that naming and imagining might attract misunderstanding or skepticism. And yet, the impulse to notice was stronger than the fear, a force that could not be denied. This realization, the first recognition of patterns in the stars, was not an isolated moment. It was a culmination of weeks, months, perhaps years of quiet attention. Day after day, the child had observed the movement of animals, the shifting of seasons, the cycles of the moon. Every observation had trained the mind to notice subtle differences, to compare, to remember, to anticipate. The stars were now simply another element in this growing web of awareness. The mind, practiced in perception, could now extend beyond earthbound patterns to embrace the cosmic. It was a leap from survival to understanding, from instinct to reflection, from being to contemplating existence. In these hours of quiet night, the child also began to sense the first stirrings of narrative. Certain patterns suggested movement, conflict, or interaction. A cluster might seem to chase another across the sky, a bright star could be imagined as a guide or sentinel. These imaginative connections were not yet spoken aloud, but they were essential. They were the beginnings of myth, the embryonic form of story, the mind's attempt to contextualize observation, to transform perception into meaning. Naming would come later, but this mental mapping was the precursor, the recognition that stars, like people, could hold stories, relationships, and significance. The act of recognition was also deeply personal. No one in the tribe had yet noticed the patterns in the same way. This was an internal discovery, a private connection to the cosmos that could not yet be shared, yet would forever alter the child's perception. There was pride, though unspoken, in the realization that the mind could reach beyond the immediate, the tangible, the known. There was a thrill in understanding that some mysteries could be approached, explored, and partially comprehended. This was the quiet birth of intellectual courage, the courage to notice, to question, and to imagine beyond the known world. By the end of the night, the child had traced multiple clusters, imagined relationships, and formed a mental map of recurring stars. Each point of light had a place in the mind, a role, a significance. The realization was complete. These were not random sparks in a void, but participants in a larger design, a network of patterns that could be observed, interpreted, and eventually named. It was the first step in a journey that would transform the human experience of the cosmos, turning silent observation into story, imagination into culture, and perception into meaning. And as dawn approached, spilling pale light across the sleeping tribe, the child finally allowed the gaze to drift from the heavens. The stars remained, eternal and unchanging, yet something profound had shifted. The mind had reached out and touched them, if only in thought. The first recognition of pattern, repetition, and potential meaning had been achieved, and with it, the first step toward naming, understanding, and humanizing the cosmos had been taken. The night's quiet revelation would linger, invisible to others, yet monumental in its significance, a seed planted in the fertile imagination of a child destined to bridge the gap between earth and sky. The spark of naming came quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a gentle shift in the mind's landscape. The child lay beneath the vast night sky, eyes tracing constellations that had been imagined for nights, perhaps weeks, in private reverie. But tonight felt different. There was a clarity, a sense of readiness, as if the universe itself had invited the mind to step forward. Each star, previously a flicker of light with no identity, began to feel distinct, alive in its own right. The child felt a subtle thrill, the first intuitive understanding that naming these points of light could transform perception, turning observation into connection, the unknown into something human. It began simply. A bright star hovering near the horizon was associated with a fox seen earlier that week. The child traced the imagined line, connecting it to other faint stars nearby, creating a shape in the mind reminiscent of the animal's prowling form. Slowly, deliberately, a name was whispered internally, silent, private, almost sacred. That act, so small, was monumental. In naming, the child exercised the first human claim over the cosmos, a gentle assertion that perception could be structured, that imagination could be made tangible. Naming was not only recognition, it was creation. The child continued, each constellation forming in turn. A group of stars in a jagged cluster resembled a bird in flight, wings outstretched across the night. Another faint pattern suggested the shape of a distant ancestor, arms reaching skyward. Names flowed, not arbitrarily, but with the weight of significance, drawn from observation, memory, and emotion. Each name was a story compressed into a word, a bridge between the visible and the imagined, between the night sky and the mind's interior landscape. In this quiet act, the child began what would one day become humanity's most enduring habit, the transformation of the natural world into symbols of meaning. Emotion accompanied every decision. Pride, excitement, fear, and awe intermingled in a way that was entirely new. Naming the stars was exhilarating, yet fragile. The mind understood instinctively that these names, though powerful internally, were vulnerable. They were ideas as delicate as the threads of a spider's web, held together by attention and imagination alone. To utter them aloud too soon might invite misunderstanding or ridicule. To forget them might erase the first bridge between earth and sky. And yet the compulsion to continue was irresistible, the need to impose identity and order on the vastness of the night more urgent than fear. As the child named star after star, there was a growing sense of sequence and relationship. Some stars seemed to lead, while others followed. Certain clusters appeared to interact, forming stories of movement, conflict, or guidance. These observations were not yet conscious reasoning, they were intuition shaped by pattern recognition and imagination. The mind was learning to categorize, organize, and connect, creating a conceptual map that went beyond the immediate and tangible. In this sense, naming became an act of intellectual expansion, extending the boundaries of awareness, and quietly laying the foundation for symbolic thinking, storytelling, and culture itself. The environment remained a quiet partner in this discovery. The wind rustled gently through the leaves, the fire's embers glowed faintly, and nocturnal animals moved in the distance, their subtle sounds providing rhythm to observation. The night seemed unusually still, almost sacred, as though it understood the significance of what was unfolding below. Each star, each flicker of light, seemed to respond, magnifying the child's focus, deepening the sense of intimacy between observer and cosmos. It was a night that would be remembered, though only internally, marking the beginning of a journey that would span a lifetime and ripple through generations. Naming stars was also an act of emotional connection. By assigning identity to these distant points of light, the child bridged the gap between human experience and the vast, indifferent universe. Each star now had personality, meaning, and presence. Fear of the unknown began to recede, replaced by a quiet joy, a sense that understanding was possible. The child felt, for the first time, that humans could reach out to the infinite, make it familiar, and claim it in some small but profound way. This realization, deep, unspoken, transformative, was a foundational moment, the first step toward culture, science, and philosophy. The act of naming was also inherently creative. It was an imaginative leap, linking the visible with the invisible, reality with memory, observation with emotion. Each decision, choosing one animal over another, one gesture over a different one, was a reflection of the child's inner world. These names were not static, they were alive, flowing naturally from perception and feeling. The night sky became a canvas, and the mind became both artist and observer, creating a visual and emotional map of meaning. In this way, the simple act of naming became an extraordinary exercise of both intellect and imagination, a quietly revolutionary moment in human history. As the hours passed, the child's focus deepened. More distant, fainter stars were claimed and connected. Patterns became more elaborate, shapes more intricate. Each connection, each name, reinforced the growing sense of structure, of order, of significance. This was no longer mere observation, it was interpretation, the first conscious attempt to organize the universe into a human framework. The child's mind had taken raw perception and transformed it into symbolic knowledge, a bridge between instinct and understanding, between sensory experience and abstract thought. By the time the first pale light of dawn touched the horizon, the child had created an entire sky of meaning. Dozens of stars had been observed, imagined, and named. Invisible lines connected them into shapes that told stories, suggested relationships, and reflected the life of the tribe below. Though unspoken, these names carried immense significance, forming the earliest recorded act of symbolic thought applied to the cosmos. The child understood, in a quiet and instinctive way, that something fundamental had shifted. Observation had become comprehension. Wonder had become structure. Curiosity had become creation. And so, in the quiet hours before dawn, the child lay back on the cold earth, eyes lingering on the newly named constellations. Each star, now imbued with identity, seemed to pulse with significance, responding to the recognition that had finally arrived. The night, once indifferent, had become intimate, familiar, and profoundly human. It was a beginning that was invisible to anyone else, yet monumental in its implications, the first act of naming, the first act of claiming knowledge, and the first step in humanity's timeless journey to understand, interpret, and find meaning in the vast expanse of the universe. The night's discovery did not remain entirely hidden. Though the child had been careful, the presence of other eyes, curious, cautious, or simply awake, was inevitable. A few members of the tribe had stirred in the late hours, drawn by the faint movement near the fire, or the soft sounds of shifting on the cold ground. Their eyes, adjusting to the darkness, fell upon the child, lying on the earth, tracing shapes and patterns in the night sky with quiet gestures. Some paused, unsure whether to speak, sensing that something unusual was unfolding. Others looked away, too preoccupied with their own immediate concerns, yet unable to fully ignore the intensity emanating from the small figure beneath the stars. The child sensed the presence of others, though attention remained fixed on the sky. Pride mingled with caution, an awareness that what had been discovered, however internally monumental, might be met with misunderstanding. To name the stars, to see connections invisible to others, was a subtle act of daring. It was an intellectual and imaginative leap that went beyond survival, ritual, or tradition. Some adults might dismiss it, some might fear it. Yet the child persisted, heart and mind locked on the constellations, tracing lines and imagining stories as though the others were invisible. In that persistence, there was courage, quiet and unacknowledged, yet deeply human. When a few tribe members eventually observed the shapes forming in the child's mind, reactions varied widely. Some were bemused, glancing from one star to another with curiosity tempered by incomprehension. Others were skeptical, questioning whether such attention to distant lights could hold any value. What does it matter, they might have thought. Life on Earth demanded more immediate engagement, food, safety, shelter. But even within these reactions, a subtle awareness of novelty emerged. The child's act was unprecedented, suggesting that the universe could be understood in a way that no one else had yet imagined. This mixture of doubt and intrigue laid the foundation for cultural evolution, the earliest stirrings of curiosity shared within a community. A few younger children, stirred from sleep, watched quietly, their eyes reflecting both the flicker of embers and the brilliance of stars. They were drawn to the child's focus, sensing something profound without fully understanding it. It was contagious, this quiet wonder, a magnetic pull of attention toward the heavens. Even without words, the child communicated a sense of significance, a silent invitation to notice, to imagine, to participate in a world beyond immediate survival. In this subtle transfer of attention, the first seeds of collective awareness were planted. The sky, once indifferent, had begun to engage the tribe in a manner never before experienced. The adults' reactions were layered with social tension. Authority in the tribe relied on experience, strength, and immediate utility. A child claiming insight into the patterns of stars challenged the hierarchy, not through confrontation, but by the quiet assertion of curiosity. Some elders might have been wary, sensing that observation without practical purpose could distract from essential survival tasks. Others might have recognized the potential, though incompletely, sensing that the child's attention to patterns hinted at capabilities beyond instinct, a nascent understanding of order, structure, and meaning that might one day benefit the group. The night became a subtle negotiation between tradition and innovation, observation and practicality, caution and curiosity. Yet the child remained undeterred. Pride was tempered by patience and subtle awareness, an understanding that revelation was fragile, dependent on timing and perception. To share too much too soon might invite misunderstanding or even ridicule. To remain silent risked isolation. The child had already crossed the threshold of comprehension, forming mental constellations, naming stars, and imagining relationships that no one else had yet considered. Now, in the presence of witnessing eyes, there was an implicit tension, the first encounter between a pioneering mind and the collective perception of a community. It was the delicate beginning of human transmission of knowledge. In the quiet, the child continued to trace invisible lines across the sky, forming connections with unspoken confidence. Each star's imagined identity was reinforced by attention, each name becoming more certain, more structured, more real. Observers could see the gestures, the intensity, perhaps even sense the emotional weight of the discovery, yet they could not fully grasp the significance. This imbalance of understanding highlighted a fundamental truth: perception is personal, discovery often solitary, yet the impulse to share and communicate is intrinsic to human nature. The first steps toward collective storytelling were unfolding silently beneath the stars. The night's lessons extended beyond observation into the realm of social awareness. The child began to understand, implicitly, that knowledge alone was insufficient, recognition, trust, and timing were equally important. Innovation, even in a simple act like naming stars, required patience and subtlety. The mind had glimpsed not only the cosmos, but also the social dynamics that would shape the transmission of knowledge across generations. In these early hours, the child was learning the first rules of cultural interaction: when to show insight, how to share discovery, and how to balance individual understanding with communal life. By the time dawn began to spread its pale light across the horizon, the first stirrings of comprehension had extended beyond the child. Some tribe members, still uncertain, cast curious glances skyward, perhaps noticing connections, perhaps recalling distant stories of spirits or ancestors associated with the stars. The child's solitary recognition had, for a moment, begun to ripple outward, planting seeds of awareness, curiosity, and imagination in others. These moments, subtle and quiet, were the earliest forms of teaching, the beginnings of human storytelling, and the first recognition that knowledge could be observed, understood, and eventually shared. And so the night ended with both completion and anticipation. The child had traced shapes, formed names, and imagined relationships in the sky, unobserved yet observed. The tribe remained largely unaware of the magnitude of this act, but the first reactions had occurred: bemusement, skepticism, curiosity, and tentative attention. The night had served as both teacher and stage, allowing the child to discover, create, and assert a first, fragile understanding of the cosmos. It was a delicate moment, invisible to most, yet monumental in its implications, the first witness to the birth of human imagination, naming, and the quiet power of wonder. Dawn's first light seeped slowly across the landscape, painting the forest and plains in hues of soft gold and muted green. The tribe began to stir, their movements cautious yet habitual, honed by countless mornings of survival. The crackle of small fires being rekindled, the murmur of hushed voices, the soft thuds of children's feet against the earth, all blended into the rhythm of early day. For the child, however, the dawn brought a dual awareness, the familiar routines of daily life and the persistent echo of the night's discovery. The stars had been named, imagined, and mapped in memory, but their presence continued to resonate, like a song playing softly in the background of consciousness. The child rose, stretching limbs stiffened by the cold earth, yet the mind remained alight. Yesterday's observations had solidified into patterns, and naming had begun to transform perception into comprehension. Unlike the adults, who often moved mechanically through tasks, the child carried the night's revelation inward, a private treasure that shaped every glance and gesture. There was a subtle confidence now, a quiet certainty that attention, imagination, and persistence could uncover truths invisible to most. It was an awakening of intellectual agency, the recognition that the mind could reach beyond survival, beyond ritual, into the realm of understanding itself. As the tribe prepared for the day, the child's attention drifted again toward the sky, even under the rising sun. Though stars were fading from view, their positions and patterns lingered in memory. Every cluster, every flicker, every imagined line retained a sense of identity. The child began to anticipate their return at nightfall, to visualize shapes, to rehearse connections, and to refine the mental map. This mental rehearsal was more than memory, it was an exercise in anticipation, prediction, and abstraction. It marked the beginning of a practice that would become fundamental to human cognition, the ability to carry knowledge forward, to iterate, to improve understanding before direct observation. Other children, still partially asleep or distracted by the day's chores, occasionally glanced toward the sky with vague curiosity. Some watched the child closely, sensing the intensity of focus and the subtle gestures toward imaginary patterns. While they could not yet grasp the significance, the attention was infectious. There was a pull, a magnetic quality in the child's concentration, an unspoken communication of wonder. These small, early interactions hinted at the first steps of cultural transmission, fascination spreading not through instruction, but through observation, imitation, and shared curiosity. Adults, meanwhile, were absorbed in the practical. The hunters checked their weapons, gathered tools, and discussed routes. Those responsible for gathering surveyed the land for fruits, roots, and edible greens. Life demanded vigilance, and the pressures of survival left little room for abstraction. Yet, in subtle ways, the night's observations began to interact with the day's reality. When the child gestured upward, tracing an invisible path or pointing to a distant shape, some adults noticed the concentration and intensity, if not the specific patterns. Even without understanding, there was recognition that something unusual, intentional, and focused was occurring. This subtle acknowledgement was the first social validation of the act of attention beyond mere survival. The child's imagination now operated continuously, blending observation with memory and anticipation. Mental constellations formed and reformed, adjusted for movement, brightness, and position. Some were anchored in reality, inspired by animals or environmental features. Others were purely symbolic, abstract representations of stories, ideas, or relationships. Each constellation was a microcosm of understanding, a personal map of meaning that would eventually inform narrative, myth, and culture. In these moments, the act of seeing became inseparable from the act of thinking, perception fused with cognition, and wonder merged with structure. Emotion played a critical role in sustaining attention. The exhilaration of discovery, tempered by the fragility of secrecy, produced a heightened sense of awareness. Pride, fear, awe, and joy intermingled, guiding perception and shaping memory. Each constellation named, each imagined story woven, reinforced the child's sense of capability. It was not merely a mental exercise, it was a deeply human experience, blending intellect, imagination, and emotion in a manner that strengthened both cognition and self-awareness. The child had learned that understanding could be both practical and profoundly personal, a source of power and connection. The forest and landscape itself seemed to respond to this newfound awareness. Sounds of rustling leaves, bird calls, and distant animal movement became part of the mental tapestry, forming rhythm, contrast, and context for reflection. The rising sun illuminated patterns in shadows, hinted at movement, and reinforced the understanding of cyclical behavior in nature. Observation of the stars was mirrored in observation of the world, tracking, anticipating, and recognizing order. The child's mind was learning that patterns were everywhere, in both the visible and invisible, and that attention could extract meaning from both chaos and constancy. As the day unfolded, practical lessons intertwined with imaginative reflection. While fetching water or helping gather food, the child's gaze often drifted upward, silently checking imagined connections between points of light, reinforcing names, and refining stories. The activity itself became a form of meditation, integrating routine action with mental rehearsal. In this way, the mind was exercising memory, visualization, and abstraction simultaneously, reinforcing neural pathways that would support higher-order thinking and symbolic understanding. Even in the mundane, the child's imagination remained engaged, bridging daily life with cosmic insight. Social dynamics subtly influenced the child's process. Younger siblings and peers observed quietly, sometimes mimicking gestures or repeating silent rituals of attention. This unspoken engagement hinted at the earliest forms of shared cognition, a precursor to communal storytelling, teaching, and culture. Adults, though largely unaware, provided a stable backdrop, ensuring survival while leaving mental space for exploration. The interaction between individual insight and communal life demonstrated that cognitive development did not occur in isolation. It was nurtured by both solitude and society, by observation and participation, by curiosity tempered with social awareness. By late afternoon, the child had internalized a detailed mental map of the night sky. Shapes, stories, names, and relationships were fully formed and rehearsed. Even as shadows lengthened and the sun began to dip toward the horizon, the mind remained occupied with the anticipation of nightfall. The stars would return, and with them, the opportunity to engage again in the intimate, creative, and contemplative act of naming. The day had been a bridge, integrating observation with imagination, reflection with action, and the individual mind with social and environmental context. It was a continuous journey, linking experience across time, space, and consciousness. As evening approached, the child felt a quiet thrill of anticipation. Night would bring both solitude and continuity. The constellations, now named and understood internally, would appear once more, offering validation, opportunity, and deeper insight. There was no anxiety, only a sense of preparedness, confidence, and curiosity. The mind, enriched by hours of reflection and anticipation, was ready to engage with the stars again, to deepen the understanding, and to strengthen the fragile bridge between human perception and the cosmos. And so the day ended, ordinary in its activities yet extraordinary in its mental significance. The child had spent hours reinforcing patterns, rehearsing names, and imagining stories, preparing for the night to come. The universe, once silent and distant, had become intimate, understandable, and humanized. It was a quiet victory, invisible to most, yet monumental in its impact, a continuation of the first act of naming, understanding, and connecting with the infinite. This day, like the night before, marked the ongoing emergence of imagination, abstraction, and human cognition, the first steps in a journey that would forever alter the relationship between humanity and the cosmos. Nightfall returned, carrying with it a familiar sense of quiet anticipation. The tribe had settled into routines, fires glowing softly against the deepening shadows, and nocturnal sounds weaving a tapestry of life and subtle tension. The child, already attuned to the rhythms of both day and night, moved to a familiar spot, laying upon the cold, hard earth, eyes lifted toward the sky. Each star, now vividly remembered, reasserted its presence, like old friends returning from a distant journey. The act of seeing was no longer simple observation, it was recognition, a conversation between memory and perception, imagination and reality. The stars emerged gradually, their positions familiar yet subtly different, as if each night offered new nuance and subtle variation. The child's mind, trained in careful attention, detected these differences immediately. Some stars appeared slightly shifted, hidden momentarily behind a wisp of cloud or tree branches. Others glimmered more brightly, catching attention as though asserting significance. The mental map formed over prior nights allowed the child to anticipate positions, connect clusters, and trace shapes effortlessly. There was a sense of mastery, subtle and private, over a world that remained mysterious to all others. Imagination continued to intertwine with observation. The constellations, previously formed in fleeting mental sketches, now seemed to possess agency, as though the stars themselves were guiding the child's perception. A cluster once resembling a prowling wolf now suggested motion, a silent chase across the sky. Another, imagined as a soaring bird, seemed to flap its wings with every blink, rhythmically marking the passage of time. These constellations were no longer static, they were narratives in motion, dynamic reflections of stories drawn from memory, environment, and the child's growing emotional understanding. This night, the act of naming evolved further. Internal words, once whispered privately in the mind, took on layered significance. Each name carried not only recognition but emotion, memory, and intention. Naming was no longer a simple exercise, it had become an act of creation. To assign identity to a distant star was to establish connection, to assert understanding over chaos, to humanize the indifferent cosmos. The child recognized that these names, once fixed in memory, could serve as anchors, points of reference not only for observation but for thought, reflection, and eventually communication. Emotion intertwined with every perception. Awe, joy, and subtle pride accompanied the act of seeing, while a faint thread of fear lingered, the fear that such knowledge was fragile, that it could be lost if attention wavered, or misunderstood if shared too soon. This tension heightened the sense of focus, making each gesture, each line traced in the mind, deliberate and sacred. The child's consciousness had expanded, embracing both the visible universe and the internal experience of wonder. It was an early form of reflective thought, a layering of perception, imagination, and emotion that would become foundational to human cognition. The natural world provided rhythm and context. The distant hoot of an owl, the whisper of wind through leaves, and the rustle of nocturnal creatures all contributed to a backdrop that sharpened attention and deepened perception. Every movement, sound, and shadow became part of the experience, integrated into the mental exercise of observation. The child was not isolated from nature, rather, the environment was a partner, shaping awareness, guiding imagination, and reinforcing the connection between mind and cosmos. Even the cold of the earth beneath the body became a grounding force, anchoring thought while the imagination soared. Other members of the tribe were largely unaware of the full extent of the child's activity, yet subtle glances and quiet observations began to ripple outward. Younger children occasionally watched in fascination, drawn by gestures or whispered murmurs. A few adults noticed intensity in posture, focus in expression, but did not comprehend its meaning. These early interactions hinted at the beginnings of cultural transmission, not through formal teaching, but through silent observation and shared attention. The child's private act of understanding was beginning, in small ways, to touch the collective consciousness of the group. The constellations themselves began to take on relational meaning. Patterns suggested motion, interaction, and hierarchy, reflecting both the child's experiences and imagination. One cluster appeared to chase another across the sky, mirroring predator and prey observed during daytime hunts. Another formation suggested guidance or protection, echoing the protective presence of elders and ancestors in stories told by the fire. Through these imagined relationships, the stars became more than mere points of light, they were a narrative framework, an early attempt to interpret the cosmos as a meaningful system rather than a backdrop of random illumination. Time passed unnoticed, measured not by clocks but by subtle changes, the rotation of constellations, the slow arc of a bright star across the horizon, and the faint illumination of the rising moon. Attention deepened, focus intensified, and imagination flourished. Every constellation named, every line traced mentally, reinforced a growing sense of comprehension and control. The child's mind was no longer a passive observer, it had become an active interpreter, capable of structuring thought, creating relationships, and synthesizing observation into meaning. The night sky, infinite and silent, had become an intimate companion, responsive in its constancy, yet challenging in its vastness. By the late hours, the child had not only named individual stars but had begun to link clusters into larger narratives. These constellations, imagined as stories or journeys, formed a complex mental map of the sky, integrating memory, observation, and emotion. Each line, each shape, each name was a deliberate act of cognition, a quiet assertion of understanding over the unknown. The child was engaging in an early form of abstraction, the precursor to both mythology and scientific thought, demonstrating that the human mind could impose order and significance upon the infinite. Finally, as the first hints of pre-dawn light began to soften the sky, the child allowed the gaze to drift downward. The stars remained, eternal in their distant brilliance, yet the act of observation had transformed them. They were no longer anonymous points of light, they were named, mapped, and emotionally understood. The mental constellations would endure, guiding future reflection and anticipation. The night had been a full journey, discovery, creation, emotional engagement, and silent cultural transmission. It was a quiet triumph, invisible to most, yet monumental in the child's cognitive and emotional development, a pivotal step in humanity's journey to understand, interpret, and narrate the universe. The following days were marked by a quiet, contemplative rhythm. The child moved among the tribe, participating in routine tasks yet carrying the luminous memory of nights spent tracing constellations. Each glance skyward brought flashes of recall, patterns, shapes, names, and relationships carefully internalized and rehearsed. The act of observing and naming had become not merely a mental exercise but a way of integrating the cosmos into everyday life. Even mundane tasks, gathering water, sharpening tools, tending fires, were subtly guided by this expanded awareness, infusing each moment with reflection, anticipation, and wonder. The mind, now accustomed to bridging observation and imagination, began to explore possibilities beyond the visible. Questions emerged, unspoken yet insistent. Why do stars remain in place while the sun and moon move? What causes certain clusters to vanish behind clouds, only to reappear later? These inquiries were not yet scientific in the modern sense, but they reflected the emergence of curiosity as a driving force, a motivation to understand not just what is, but why it is. The child's awareness had shifted from mere observation to a nascent form of inquiry, a foundational step toward reasoning and systematic thought. Observation continued to sharpen the senses. Details that previously went unnoticed, the subtle difference in brightness between stars, the faint twinkle of a distant cluster, the slow, predictable drift across the sky, were now significant. The child began to anticipate movements, to notice deviations from expectation, and to incorporate these observations into the mental map of the cosmos. Each night of attention strengthened the neural pathways of memory, abstraction, and pattern recognition. It was an early form of experimentation, a rehearsal for methods that would millennia later become the foundation of astronomy and scientific reasoning. Emotional resonance remained central. Naming stars and connecting constellations was no longer just an intellectual endeavor, it carried deep personal significance. Pride, awe, and joy were intertwined with quiet reflection and the thrill of discovery. The child began to recognize the profound satisfaction of understanding something invisible to others, a subtle power inherent in perception and imagination. There was also humility, a recognition that the universe was vast, ancient, and indifferent, and that the human mind, though capable of insight, was only beginning to comprehend its scale and intricacy. This duality, empowerment tempered by awareness of limitation, became a cornerstone of early philosophical reflection. The social context remained significant. Other children occasionally observed the child's gestures, subtly imitating attention and curiosity. Adults, though focused on survival, occasionally noticed unusual postures, intense focus, or quiet gestures directed toward the heavens. These moments, though fragmented and partially understood, represented the earliest forms of cultural diffusion. Knowledge began to ripple outward not through formal teaching but through silent observation, imitation, and shared attention. The child's engagement with the cosmos, once private and solitary, was beginning to influence the broader community, laying the groundwork for collective understanding and communal storytelling. Night continued to serve as a catalyst for reflection. The child often lingered after other tribe members had gone to rest, eyes tracing the familiar constellations. Shapes evolved, stories deepened, and new connections emerged. One constellation, initially imagined as a bird in flight, began to suggest patterns of migration or seasonal movement. Another, shaped like a prowling predator, reflected lessons learned from observing animals during the day. Observation of natural cycles, memory of events, and imagination of narrative were fused into a holistic understanding of the environment. Knowledge of the stars and understanding of earthly phenomena became intertwined, reinforcing both survival skills and symbolic thinking. Dreams, too, became a space for rehearsal. The child's subconscious revisited the night sky, replaying constellations, refining shapes, and experimenting with names. Sleep became a laboratory for cognitive integration, blending perception, memory, imagination, and emotional engagement. This nocturnal rehearsal strengthened understanding, enhanced creativity, and prepared the mind for new observations. It was an unconscious extension of the conscious act of naming, demonstrating that cognition extended beyond active attention and into cycles of rest, reflection, and dream. The act of naming began to acquire philosophical depth. The child sensed, intuitively, that assigning identity to the stars was not merely practical or playful, it was transformative. Each name asserted connection, understanding, and presence. By naming a star, the child acknowledged its existence, recognized its role in the larger pattern, and integrated it into the mental narrative of the cosmos. This realization carried profound implications. Awareness was not passive, it could shape perception, assign meaning, and foster connection with the universe. In this quiet, internal dialogue, the first stirrings of human philosophy emerged, linking observation, imagination, and reflection into coherent understanding. By the end of the day, the child's mental map had grown richer, more intricate, and increasingly dynamic. Constellations were linked not just in static arrangements, but through implied stories, relationships, and movement. Some clusters were imagined as traveling together, while others were seen in tension or pursuit, echoing the natural rhythms of life on Earth. This integration of narrative, observation, and abstraction created a cognitive framework that was simultaneously practical, emotional, and symbolic. The night sky had become both a canvas for imagination and a tool for understanding, bridging the gap between the tangible and intangible, the immediate and eternal. In these hours, the child also became aware of time itself. Patterns repeated, stars moved predictably, and the cycles of night and day formed a rhythm. This awareness of repetition, continuity, and sequence introduced the first sense of temporal order. Nights and days were not merely events but markers of cycles, a framework for anticipation and planning. This nascent understanding of time would have profound implications, enabling the mind to organize experiences, predict events, and integrate knowledge across days, seasons, and years. It was an essential step in the emergence of human cognition and culture. As evening approached once more, the child felt a profound connection with both the cosmos and the self. The stars were no longer distant, abstract points of light, they were companions, guides, and mirrors reflecting internal understanding. Every gesture, thought, and name had reinforced the bridge between perception and comprehension, imagination and memory, observation and philosophy. The night promised continuation, further refinement of constellations, deeper engagement with stories, and the ongoing integration of wonder and reflection into daily life. Finally, as darkness settled fully and the first stars appeared in the night sky, the child lay beneath them with anticipation, pride, and reverence. Each point of light, now named, mapped, and emotionally understood, pulsed with significance. The constellations were living narratives, dynamic and evolving, capable of holding story, memory, and understanding simultaneously. The night had become a sacred space, a laboratory of thought and imagination, a bridge between self and universe. The act of naming, begun quietly and privately, had now matured into a profound engagement with the cosmos, laying the foundation for human cognition, storytelling, and the eternal impulse to seek meaning in the infinite. The night had become a sanctuary. The tribe slept in scattered clusters, fires dwindled to glowing embers, and the forest exhaled a quiet rhythm, punctuated by distant animal calls and rustling leaves. For the child, this was the hour of full immersion. Eyes lifted toward the sky, each star was not merely a point of light, but a character, a story, a presence with significance and place. The constellations, once faint and imagined, now pulsed with clarity. Every connection traced in the mind was deliberate, rehearsed, and deeply meaningful. This was no longer play, it was engagement with the cosmos in its most intimate form, a dialogue between imagination, perception, and reflection. The constellations had evolved into a complex mental ecosystem. Stars that were once named individually were now understood as part of relationships, forming sequences and arcs that suggested movement, tension, and narrative. One cluster might chase another across the sky, echoing predator-prey dynamics observed during the day. Another suggested guardianship or protection, reflecting the tribe's social structures and ancestral guidance. Through these evolving constellations, the child's mind practiced abstraction, the ability to integrate observation, memory, and imagination into a coherent framework, a cognitive leap that would become foundational to human storytelling, culture, and philosophy. Emotion guided each act of observation. Pride was intertwined with awe, excitement with humility. The child understood that this knowledge, though powerful internally, was fragile, reliant on attention, memory, and imagination. Each constellation named and linked reinforced a sense of competence and purpose, while the vast, indifferent sky imposed a quiet humility. The stars were eternal, unyielding, and unknowable in their totality, yet through observation and imagination, the child could assert a measure of understanding, a claim of cognitive presence in a universe that otherwise remained beyond reach. Social awareness remained a subtle, persistent influence. Though the tribe slept, the child's mind occasionally reflected on the reactions of others, the curiosity of peers, the bemusement of elders, the silent attention of siblings. These faint ripples of social perception were important, suggesting that knowledge was not only an individual pursuit but also inherently relational. Innovation and insight existed in the mind first, yet human experience required communication, observation, and eventual sharing. The child's solitary act was quietly preparing for future transmission, laying the groundwork for culture, mentorship, and collective understanding. The act of naming continued to evolve into philosophical reflection. Each star, each constellation, became a point of inquiry. Why does this cluster move predictably while others wander? What forces govern the night sky? Though lacking formal theory, the child began to intuit that patterns and order could exist independently of human necessity or observation. This recognition, that structure, predictability, and relationship could be inherent in the universe, was a profound cognitive leap. It represented the early stirrings of abstract thought, an understanding that the cosmos could be interpreted, predicted, and ultimately understood, even if only partially. Imagination remained central. The child visualized constellations not only as static shapes but as dynamic narratives. Stars moved along imagined trajectories, interacted, and responded to one another in ways that mirrored life on Earth. This interplay between perception and creative projection strengthened the mind's ability to model complex systems, anticipate movement, and integrate emotional and practical understanding. Even in the absence of external validation, the child's internal universe expanded, forming a mental space where observation, story, and reflection converged seamlessly. Attention to detail was honed further. Differences in brightness, subtle shifts in position, and the faintest variations in color or twinkle became significant. The child's mind catalogued these variations, refining the mental map, adjusting names, and considering relational dynamics. Each act of attention reinforced memory, visualization, and cognitive flexibility. The night had become a laboratory for both emotional and intellectual growth, where the raw material of sensory perception was transformed into structured, meaningful knowledge. Time and sequence emerged as integral components. The child began to notice not just individual stars or clusters, but their trajectories over the course of the night. Patterns unfolded, repeated, and transformed, creating a sense of temporal rhythm. Observation was no longer static, it was dynamic, anticipating the arc of the night and predicting the reappearance of stars in coming cycles. This recognition of temporal order marked an essential milestone in cognitive development, enabling the child to link events, anticipate recurrence, and integrate knowledge across both space and time. By the middle of the night, constellations had taken on layers of symbolic meaning. One cluster suggested guidance, another conflict, a third protection. These abstractions reflected both the child's direct experiences and the broader social and environmental world of the tribe. Observation, memory, and imagination were now fully interwoven, creating a sophisticated internal framework for understanding the universe. Naming had matured into interpretation, and interpretation had become reflection, demonstrating the mind's ability to synthesize sensory input, emotional resonance, and conceptual insight. Even as the night progressed, the child's engagement remained undiminished. Fatigue, though present, was overshadowed by fascination, pride, and the deep satisfaction of mastery. Each constellation confirmed the mind's ability to observe, interpret, and organize, while every moment of reflection reinforced the connection between self and cosmos. The child's inner world had expanded, integrating emotion, observation, memory, and imagination into a cohesive experience. This act of cognitive growth was silent, invisible to the tribe, yet monumental in its long-term significance. Finally, as the first hints of dawn painted the horizon, the child allowed the gaze to drift downward. The constellations, named, traced, and imagined, remained vivid in memory. The sky had become a repository of stories, a map of relationships, and a canvas for reflection. The night had been a journey, observation, creation, emotional engagement, and subtle social awareness. Each act, though private, contributed to the emergence of cognition, imagination, and early cultural insight. The stars had been named, not merely for recognition, but for understanding, connection, and the quiet assertion of human presence in the vast, indifferent universe. As the light of day returned, the child carried this quiet triumph forward. The constellations were no longer only a night's exercise, they had become a living framework for thought, memory, and imagination, ready to interact with daily life. The integration of the cosmic and terrestrial, the observed and imagined, the personal and social, had reached a new level of sophistication. This was the first conscious fusion of wonder, cognition, and reflection, a foundational moment in the long human journey to interpret, narrate, and understand the universe. The child awoke before dawn, as if drawn by an invisible thread to the returning sky. The first faint light brushed the horizon, yet the stars, stubborn and persistent, still clung to the dark canvas above. There was a sense of anticipation, as though the universe itself recognized the child's vigilance, and the mind prepared for another night of observation, reflection, and silent engagement. Every previous night had built a foundation, yet this night promised refinement, exploration, and deeper connection. The constellations were familiar, yet dynamic, offering subtle variations that demanded attention and interpretation. As the tribe remained largely asleep, the child moved to a familiar vantage point, the cold earth beneath a grounding presence, the quiet forest around a companionable observer. The mental map formed over days and nights had matured. Each star held identity, every cluster suggested relationship, and each line traced in imagination carried significance. Observation was now interwoven with narrative, the stars were characters, each with purpose and interplay. Some suggested movement, others tension, and others continuity. The mind, trained through repetition, was capable of anticipating motion, predicting interactions, and experimenting with hypothetical narratives that bridged perception and imagination. Emotion remained central. The exhilaration of creation, the pride of insight, and the humility imposed by the infinite cosmos blended seamlessly. The child had come to recognize that knowledge carried responsibility, the responsibility of attention, of memory, of interpretation. Each constellation named, each pattern traced, represented both understanding and commitment. The act of engagement was an assertion that humans, though small and fragile, could comprehend, interpret, and find meaning in an indifferent universe. This was not mere curiosity, it was the first emergence of deliberate cognition intertwined with wonder. The child's reflection extended beyond the cosmos to the earth below. Patterns in animal movement, cycles of seasons, and interactions within the tribe now informed celestial observation. A hunting path mirrored an imagined constellation. The sway of trees echoed lines traced in the sky. Events on Earth, predator and prey, light and shadow, movement and stillness, became intertwined with the constellations, creating a layered understanding of both terrestrial and celestial patterns. Knowledge was integrated. The universe was neither abstract nor disconnected but an extension of lived experience, shaped by attention, imagination, and reflection. Social dynamics continued to influence the child's engagement. Though adults remained unaware of the full depth of this activity, the presence of peers and siblings shaped subtle behaviors. Younger children occasionally watched, silently imitating gestures, while older siblings glanced with curiosity or bemusement. The child intuitively navigated these dynamics, balancing solitary reflection with awareness of others' presence. This delicate interplay between individual cognition and social context was a cornerstone of cultural development. The mind was capable of innovation, yet understanding social reality was necessary for the transmission of knowledge. Night deepened, and the child's attention sharpened. Each star, faint or bright, was catalogued, named, and connected. Some clusters were imagined as beings in motion, interacting, pursuing, or guiding each other. Others formed protective frameworks, reflective of social bonds and observed hierarchies within the tribe. Memory, imagination, and observation converged, producing a sophisticated internal map capable of both abstract thought and applied understanding. This cognitive exercise was transformative, blending imagination, analysis, and emotional resonance into a unified experience. Time itself became more apparent. The child noticed sequences, rhythms, and cycles, the slow arc of a bright star, the subtle drift of a faint cluster, and the eventual disappearance and reappearance of constellations across nights. This awareness of continuity allowed prediction, reflection, and comparison. The mind began to grasp temporal relationships, anticipating the future based on past observation, and integrating discrete events into a coherent framework. This was a significant step toward structured cognition, an early recognition of order within the apparent chaos of the natural world. Emotion and imagination continued to shape observation. Naming was not merely functional but poetic, imbued with personal significance and narrative resonance. A star might be a guardian, a cluster a journey, and an arc a story of pursuit. Every act of observation reinforced identity and connection, blending logic with feeling, perception with interpretation. The night became a canvas for exploration, a laboratory for thought, and a theater for the mind. The constellations were alive, dynamic, and meaningful, a reflection of human capacity to transform raw perception into understanding and narrative. Subtle interaction with the environment enriched cognition. The whisper of the wind, rustling leaves, and distant nocturnal creatures became a backdrop, a rhythm that guided attention. Changes in temperature, the movement of shadows, and even the soft crunch of the earth underfoot contributed to the immersive experience. Sensory input was integrated with mental constructs, producing a holistic perception that combined observation, emotion, memory, and imagination. The child's mind was learning to synthesize multiple layers of information, a foundational skill for higher reasoning, planning, and abstraction. By the middle of the night, constellations had matured into dynamic systems. Stars were no longer isolated, they existed in networks of interaction, echoing events and patterns observed on Earth. One cluster might chase another, reflecting predator-prey dynamics. Another might offer protection, mirroring social bonds. This sophisticated mental modeling marked a profound cognitive advance, blending observation, imagination, memory, and inference. The child had transformed the night sky into both a map and a story, a structure of understanding that bridged sensory input and abstract thought. As the night progressed, anticipation of dawn did not diminish engagement. The child remained deeply attentive, knowing that continuity of observation was essential. Each night reinforced memory, refined narrative, and strengthened the mental framework. The constellations, once simple points of light, were now robust, coherent, and layered with meaning. Observation had become deliberate, reflective, and philosophical, a private meditation on existence, order, and connection. Finally, as the first pale light of dawn crept across the horizon, the child lingered a moment longer, committing each constellation, name, and relationship to memory. The night had been a profound journey, observation, imagination, reflection, and subtle social awareness intertwined seamlessly. The constellations were now both internalized and dynamic, a mental universe that could be carried forward into waking life, informing thought, behavior, and understanding. This quiet triumph, invisible to most of the tribe, was monumental in its implications, a foundational act of cognition, imagination, and symbolic thought, the human mind reaching toward comprehension of the cosmos. The day ahead would demand attention to survival, social interaction, and routine tasks. Yet the child carried the night's insights forward, integrating them into lived experience. Observation, naming, and narrative were no longer separate from daily life, they were interwoven, shaping perception, guiding thought, and reinforcing memory. The constellations had become both mental companions and cognitive tools, illustrating the emergence of reflective consciousness, imagination, and the subtle beginnings of philosophy. The child's connection with the night sky deepened with each passing evening. By now, observation had become a deliberate practice, a ritual of attention and imagination woven into the rhythms of daily life. As the tribe engaged in its routines, gathering, hunting, tending fires, the child's mind was already rehearsing the night's upcoming encounter with the stars. Memory and anticipation coalesced, shapes, lines, and clusters were recalled with precision, while new potential connections formed, waiting to be tested when darkness fell. The sky had become a living map, a framework for reflection, and a canvas for the imagination, simultaneously personal and universal. Nightfall arrived with the familiar hush of anticipation. The forest's nocturnal symphony, the rustle of leaves, distant calls of owls, and the faint movements of small animals, was a gentle backdrop for mental focus. The child settled into the familiar spot, cold earth beneath, sky above, and mind attuned to every flicker and glow. The constellations, once tentative and fluid, now carried clarity and definition. Stars were no longer solitary points of light, they were participants in a complex, interconnected system. Each connection traced, each shape named, was a deliberate act of understanding, reinforcing both memory and conceptual insight. Imagination had become more than creative play, it was a tool for interpretation and reflection. Constellations were animated narratives, moving through the sky as if alive. A cluster shaped like a predator now pursued another, echoing lessons from daily observation. Another cluster suggested guardianship or protection, mirroring social structures observed within the tribe. The mind integrated narrative, pattern recognition, and abstraction seamlessly, producing a dynamic model of the cosmos that could be manipulated mentally, rehearsed, and reflected upon. This was a foundational act of cognitive development, blending observation, emotion, and imagination into structured understanding. Emotion infused every observation with significance. Pride, awe, and quiet exhilaration reinforced the child's attention, while humility in the face of the infinite sky tempered overconfidence. Knowledge had become a source of internal power, yet the vastness of the universe imposed perspective. The child understood, instinctively, that the act of naming was both an assertion of comprehension and a recognition of limits. Each constellation was a triumph of human perception, yet also a reminder of the immensity beyond human grasp. This delicate balance of confidence and humility was central to the emergence of reflective thought. The natural world continued to shape cognition. Sounds, shadows, and subtle movements provided context for observation, grounding imagination in sensory reality. The gentle whisper of the wind, the faint rustle of nocturnal creatures, and the distant call of birds created rhythm and contrast, guiding attention and enhancing focus. Changes in brightness, position, and movement of stars were contrasted with terrestrial patterns, allowing the mind to integrate multiple streams of information. Observation was holistic, incorporating perception, memory, imagination, and emotion into a unified experience. Social awareness remained present, even in solitude. The child's awareness of peers, siblings, and adults subtly influenced behavior, reinforcing the importance of timing, discretion, and audience in acts of cognition. Innovation could not exist entirely in isolation. Understanding the social environment was essential for eventual sharing of knowledge. These early reflections on individual insight versus communal understanding laid the groundwork for culture, mentorship, and the transmission of information. Even in quiet observation, the child was learning the dynamics of social interaction, collaboration, and subtle communication. Patterns in the night sky were now interpreted as more than shapes, they suggested movement, purpose, and interaction. A cluster might appear to follow another, reflecting earthly patterns of pursuit or migration. Another might suggest hierarchy or protection, echoing social dynamics within the tribe. This layered observation strengthened cognitive flexibility, enabling the child to perceive connections between seemingly disparate elements. Abstraction, narrative construction, and pattern recognition were fused, illustrating the early human capacity to model complex systems and understand relationships in both natural and symbolic realms. Attention to detail reached a new level of sophistication. Differences in brightness, subtle color shifts, and faint twinkles were catalogued, remembered, and incorporated into the mental map. Deviations from expected positions prompted reflection, experimentation, and refinement. The child's mind was not passively observing, it was actively analyzing, testing hypotheses, and integrating new information. Observation had become a dynamic, recursive process, combining sensory perception, memory, and imaginative projection into a continuous cycle of learning and refinement. Time was now perceived as an essential framework. The child recognized sequences, cycles, and rhythms in both the night sky and the terrestrial world. The predictable movement of stars provided markers for the passage of hours, while terrestrial events, predator and prey, day and night cycles, interacted with cosmic observation to create a coherent sense of temporality. This awareness of time reinforced memory, enabled planning, and strengthened anticipation, marking a significant step in cognitive sophistication. The mind was learning to link discrete events across days, integrating observation, prediction, and reflection into a unified understanding. As the night progressed, constellations became repositories of story, meaning, and reflection. Each cluster suggested a narrative, a relationship, or an abstract principle. Some reflected practical knowledge, such as animal behavior or seasonal patterns. Others carried symbolic or emotional significance, echoing social bonds, personal experiences, or imaginative projection. Naming was no longer a simple act of identification, it was an exercise in interpretation, abstraction, and reflection. The child's engagement with the night sky had become fully multidimensional, integrating sensory, cognitive, and emotional faculties into a coherent, dynamic experience. By the early hours before dawn, the child's mind had achieved a profound synthesis. Observation, memory, imagination, and reflection were fully integrated. The constellations were internalized, dynamic, and meaningful, forming both a mental map and a narrative framework. Knowledge had become a lived experience, shaping perception, guiding thought, and enriching both individual understanding and subtle social awareness. The night had served as both laboratory and theater, a space where cognition, emotion, and imagination converged to produce the earliest forms of abstract, reflective, and symbolic thought. Finally, as the horizon began to lighten with the approach of day, the child lingered, committing each constellation, story, and name to memory. The night had been a journey of creation and comprehension, reflection and imagination. The constellations, once distant and indifferent, were now intimately known, named, and connected. This quiet act of engagement, invisible to most of the tribe, marked a pivotal moment in human cognition, the emergence of structured thought, narrative, and symbolic understanding. The child had, in essence, reached toward the cosmos and shaped it with mind, memory, and imagination, laying the foundation for the human capacity to interpret, narrate, and find meaning in the universe. The dawn after the night of deep observation carried a subtle sense of continuity. The tribe stirred, the fires rekindled, and familiar routines resumed, yet the child moved with an inner rhythm shaped by hours spent under the stars. Even in the mundane tasks of daily life, fetching water, arranging firewood, or assisting elders, the mind retained the patterns, shapes, and narratives rehearsed in darkness. There was a quiet harmony between the celestial and the terrestrial, as though the constellations now influenced not only thought but also movement, intention, and awareness. The child's cognition had expanded, bridging observation, imagination, and action in a seamless integration. Each glance upward during the day reinforced memory and anticipation. The sky, although dominated by sunlight, still suggested the constellations waiting for nightfall. Mental rehearsal had become a continuous process, mapping, naming, and connecting even without immediate visual stimulus. The mind operated as both observer and creator, rehearsing scenarios, adjusting relationships, and considering stories that might emerge once darkness returned. This premeditation marked a step toward planning and abstract thought, where imagination and memory guided anticipation and decision-making, both critical to human cognitive evolution. The social environment remained a quiet influence. Peers occasionally observed the child's gestures, subtle movements, or focused attention, though they could not yet comprehend the significance. Adults, largely preoccupied with survival, registered intensity and unusual focus without understanding. The child's solitary engagement with the cosmos was quietly preparing for cultural transmission, demonstrating that innovation often begins in private but eventually ripples outward through observation, imitation, and shared attention. These early dynamics were foundational for communal learning, storytelling, and the development of symbolic systems. Observation of the environment informed celestial reflection. Patterns of animal behavior, the movement of shadows, and the changing landscape all reinforced understanding of the cosmos. Certain clusters mirrored terrestrial forms, a prowling predator in the sky reflected lessons learned from observing hunting animals. Lines traced in constellations echoed the flow of rivers, paths of migration, or arcs of mountain ridges. This continuous interplay between earth and sky strengthened the mind's ability to abstract, connect, and interpret complex patterns, bridging practical experience with imaginative exploration. Emotion continued to shape perception and reflection. Pride, awe, curiosity, and quiet exhilaration reinforced engagement, while humility in the face of the vast sky tempered the sense of mastery. The child had begun to recognize that naming and mapping the stars was both a creative act and an acknowledgement of limits. Every constellation, every connection, and every narrative was a small assertion of understanding, yet the cosmos remained infinite, indifferent, and beyond full comprehension. This delicate balance between confidence and humility was essential to the emergence of reflective thought and philosophical awareness. Imagination, fully integrated with observation, was increasingly sophisticated. Constellations were no longer static, they shifted in narrative, mirrored motion, and suggested relational dynamics. Some clusters pursued others, reflecting predatory or migratory patterns. Others offered protection or guidance, echoing social hierarchies and familial bonds. This integration of narrative, pattern, and abstraction marked an early form of symbolic thinking, where imagination served not merely to embellish reality but to structure understanding, facilitate memory, and enable reflection. Time was increasingly perceived as a framework for organizing both observation and imagination. The child tracked sequences, rhythms, and cycles in both sky and earth. The slow arc of stars, the predictable disappearance and reappearance of clusters, and the recurring patterns of day and night created a temporal structure. This awareness of continuity allowed for anticipation, comparison, and integration across nights, enhancing memory and reflective capacity. Observation was no longer static, it was dynamic, linking events across space and time into coherent understanding. The child's engagement also began to influence subtle social dynamics. While peers and siblings could not fully comprehend the activity, silent imitation and observation suggested early mechanisms for cultural transmission. Innovation, though initially private, began to ripple outward. These interactions highlighted the importance of balancing solitary cognition with social awareness, a precursor to collective storytelling, mentorship, and shared knowledge systems. Cognitive development was thus situated both in individual experience and in relational context. By evening, the constellations had become dynamic companions. Each star and cluster carried identity, narrative, and relational significance. Some were linked to practical knowledge, such as animal behavior or environmental observation. Others carried symbolic or emotional weight, reflecting social experience, personal reflection, or imaginative projection. Naming and mapping had evolved into an integrated act of cognition, observation, abstraction, emotional resonance, and narrative construction merged seamlessly. The night sky had become both laboratory and theater, a space for reflection, creativity, and silent philosophical exploration. As darkness deepened, the child's attention sharpened further. Subtle differences in brightness, position, and pattern were catalogued, analyzed, and integrated. Mental rehearsal reinforced memory, refined relationships between clusters, and allowed imaginative experimentation. Observation had become a recursive process, where perception, memory, and imagination interacted continuously, producing a sophisticated cognitive framework. The constellations were both fixed and dynamic, points of reference, narrative elements, and tools for reflection simultaneously. Emotion remained deeply entwined with cognitive activity. Awe, pride, and quiet excitement reinforced engagement, while humility and recognition of the universe's vastness tempered overconfidence. The child's mind was learning to navigate the delicate balance between comprehension and limitation, confidence and respect. Knowledge was not merely utilitarian, it was personal, emotional, and symbolic, integrating intellect with imagination and observation with reflection. Each constellation named was a small act of meaning-making, bridging self, cosmos, and understanding. By the middle of the night, the child had constructed a fully integrated mental universe. Constellations were linked into dynamic systems, reflective of both terrestrial observation and narrative imagination. Stars moved in the mind's eye, interacted symbolically, and suggested relationships that extended beyond simple shapes. Observation, memory, abstraction, and reflection were fully intertwined, producing a holistic understanding that encompassed practical knowledge, symbolic meaning, and narrative structure. This internalized cosmic map was a foundation for cognitive, cultural, and philosophical development, laying the groundwork for both storytelling and early science. As dawn approached once more, the child lingered, committing constellations, narratives, and relationships to memory. The night had been a journey of observation, imagination, reflection, and subtle social awareness. The sky, once distant and indifferent, was now intimately known, named, and connected. This private act of engagement, invisible to the tribe, was monumental in human terms, a quiet triumph of cognition, creativity, and symbolic thought. The child had shaped the universe in mind and imagination, asserting presence, understanding, and connection in the vast, silent cosmos. The following night descended quietly, carrying with it the familiar anticipation of the child's private journey. The tribe had settled into its routines, fires glowing faintly, and the surrounding forest alive with nocturnal sounds. Yet the child moved as though guided by an invisible tether, returning to the familiar vantage point, where the cold earth grounded the body and the sky opened into infinity above. The constellations, practiced and memorized, awaited observation, yet each night brought subtle differences, new twinkles, faint shifts in position, and variations in brightness. These nuances demanded attention, fostering both precision and wonder. The mind, now accustomed to linking observation with narrative, engaged fully with the constellations. Each cluster was not merely a pattern of light but a network of relationships, motion, and potential story. One set of stars might pursue another, echoing the predator-prey dynamics observed during the day. Another could suggest guidance or protection, reflecting the social hierarchies within the tribe and the lessons learned from elders. Through this interplay, the child's cognition integrated perception, memory, imagination, and emotional understanding, producing a dynamic internal model of the cosmos. Emotion reinforced attention. Pride, awe, and quiet exhilaration mingled with humility and respect for the vast universe. The child had learned that knowledge was a delicate balance, both a source of personal empowerment and a recognition of the limits imposed by the infinite sky. Each constellation named and traced in the mind represented mastery over perception, yet the cosmos remained eternal, vast, and unknowable in its totality. This balance between accomplishment and humility was essential to reflective thought, cultivating a mind capable of both insight and reverence. The interplay between celestial and terrestrial observation grew more sophisticated. Patterns on Earth, from animal movement to seasonal changes, informed interpretation of the sky. A constellation might mimic the curve of a river, the path of migrating birds, or the stalking trajectory of a hunting predator. Observation and imagination were intertwined, allowing the mind to form abstractions, recognize complex relationships, and synthesize disparate elements into coherent understanding. The constellations had become a bridge between the immediate environment and the infinite expanse above. Social awareness subtly shaped engagement. Peers occasionally noticed gestures or intense focus, though they could not yet comprehend the activity. Adults remained largely unaware, absorbed in survival. Yet even in solitude, the child was learning the dynamics of observation, attention, and eventual transmission. Knowledge, initially private, was beginning to ripple outward. These early experiences laid the foundation for cultural continuity, mentorship, and collective understanding, where innovation and insight, though originating in the individual, would eventually influence the community. Imagination transformed observation into narrative. Stars moved dynamically in the mind's eye, creating stories of pursuit, protection, or guidance. Clusters interacted symbolically, echoing terrestrial events and social dynamics. This capacity to construct and manipulate narrative reflected a sophisticated form of symbolic thought, where imagination was not mere fantasy but a tool for understanding, memory, and reflection. Each constellation held meaning, both practical and philosophical, linking observation with interpretation and imagination with understanding. Attention to detail sharpened with repetition. Brightness, position, color, and subtle movement of stars were catalogued and interpreted. Deviations from expected patterns prompted reflection, experimentation, and refinement of mental maps. Observation had become recursive, where each act informed the next, and memory, imagination, and analysis coalesced into an integrated cognitive framework. The constellations were simultaneously fixed points and dynamic narratives, providing both reference and creative space for exploration. Time emerged as an organizing principle. Sequences, rhythms, and cycles in the sky reinforced the understanding of temporal continuity. The predictable arc of stars, the cyclical appearance and disappearance of clusters, and the repetition of daily and seasonal events provided a framework for anticipation, comparison, and memory. The child's mind linked these temporal patterns with social, environmental, and personal experiences, producing an integrated understanding of both the universe and human life. This awareness of time was crucial for planning, reflection, and higher-order cognition. Emotion and cognition became inseparable. The act of naming constellations was both practical and symbolic, fostering a sense of mastery while reinforcing connection to the universe. Pride and joy were interwoven with awe and humility, creating a complex emotional landscape that supported sustained attention and reflection. Knowledge was personal, embodied, and meaningful. Observation, imagination, and emotion converged, shaping perception, memory, and conceptual insight into a holistic experience of engagement with the cosmos. By the middle of the night, the constellations had formed a fully realized mental map. Stars were connected in networks of narrative and function, reflecting terrestrial experience, social observation, and imaginative projection. Movement, interaction, and symbolism were layered within these connections, producing a dynamic system capable of abstraction, reflection, and memory. The child's cognitive world had expanded, integrating sensory input, imagination, emotion, and temporal awareness into a coherent internal universe. The night continued as a laboratory for thought. Each star, each line, and each narrative was rehearsed and refined. Observation was active, recursive, and reflective, fostering cognitive growth and mastery over memory and abstraction. Constellations became tools for understanding relationships, predicting patterns, and exploring imaginative possibilities. The act of engagement was both intellectual and emotional, demonstrating the early emergence of reflective consciousness and symbolic reasoning. As dawn approached, the child lingered, savoring the transition from night to day. The constellations, named, mapped, and internalized, were no longer simply visual phenomena, they were companions, guides, and frameworks for understanding. The night had been a journey of creation, observation, reflection, and subtle social awareness. Knowledge, though invisible to others, was profound in its implications, a synthesis of cognition, imagination, and emotional engagement that laid the foundation for human storytelling, philosophy, and cultural development. Finally, as the first pale light illuminated the horizon, the child retreated from the vantage point, carrying with them the memory, narrative, and insight of the night. Observation, naming, and imaginative connection had transformed both mind and experience. The constellations were internalized, dynamic, and meaningful, forming the cornerstone of a cognitive universe that integrated perception, emotion, reflection, and imagination. This quiet triumph, private yet monumental, marked another step in humanity's journey to interpret, narrate, and connect with the infinite cosmos. The following evening arrived with a sense of quiet ritual. The tribe settled into routines, fires glimmering and smoke curling into the dark sky, yet the child felt an irresistible pull toward the stars. The familiar vantage point called once more, offering a direct line to the infinite above. Each night had built upon the previous, creating a rhythm of observation, reflection, and imagination that now felt as natural as breathing. The constellations awaited, but with each visit, subtle differences emerged, twinkles, faint movements, or the interplay of brightness, inviting renewed attention, insight, and emotional resonance. The child's mind had matured in its engagement with the sky. Stars were no longer isolated, they existed in dynamic systems, interacting in imagined narrative and reflecting terrestrial patterns. One cluster might pursue another, echoing predator-prey relationships observed during the day. Another suggested protection or guidance, mirroring social hierarchies and familial bonds. These mental connections were reinforced by memory, imagination, and reflection, producing a cognitive framework capable of integrating complex relational structures. Observation had become intentional, layered, and profoundly meaningful. Emotion intertwined with perception. Pride, wonder, and quiet exhilaration merged with humility before the vast, indifferent cosmos. The act of naming constellations was both assertion and acknowledgement, assertion of comprehension, acknowledgement of limits. The stars were no longer mere points of light, they were companions, narratives, and cognitive tools. This balance of mastery and reverence shaped reflective thought, nurturing a mind capable of simultaneously understanding, imagining, and respecting the infinite. The child's emotional engagement amplified both attention and retention, reinforcing learning and insight. Observation was grounded in the natural world. Patterns on Earth, animal tracks, river bends, seasonal changes, were mirrored in the sky. Constellations reflected terrestrial events, integrating practical knowledge with imaginative projection. A star cluster might resemble a stalking predator, while another traced a path reminiscent of migrating herds. This interplay between terrestrial and celestial observation enhanced abstraction, pattern recognition, and conceptual understanding. The mind synthesized sensory input, memory, and imagination into a cohesive understanding, linking lived experience to the infinite. Social awareness continued to subtly influence the child's experience. Peers occasionally observed gestures or intense focus, though comprehension remained limited. Adults, absorbed in survival, registered only intensity and stillness. Yet these interactions hinted at early cultural transmission, private cognitive achievement eventually intersecting with communal awareness. Innovation, though born in solitude, began to ripple outward, laying the foundation for shared knowledge, mentorship, and the gradual emergence of culture. Observation and reflection were thus both personal and socially contextualized. Imagination transformed observation into narrative. Constellations moved in mental projection, interacting symbolically, pursuing, guiding, or defending one another. These narratives mirrored terrestrial life, social structures, and emotional experience. This dynamic symbolic construction reflected a sophisticated level of cognitive abstraction. Imagination was no longer whimsical, it was a tool for understanding, memory, and conceptual reasoning. Each constellation embodied practical, emotional, and philosophical significance, merging perception and reflection into a holistic experience. Attention to detail deepened. Variations in brightness, subtle shifts in position, and faint twinkles became significant markers. Each observation was catalogued, analyzed, and integrated into the mental framework. Deviations prompted reflection and experimentation, reinforcing cognitive flexibility. Observation had become recursive, combining memory, imagination, and analysis. The constellations were simultaneously fixed and dynamic, reference points and narratives, tools for understanding and exploration. The child's mind had achieved a high level of sophistication in integrating observation, abstraction, and reflection. Time emerged as a guiding framework. Sequences, rhythms, and cycles in both sky and earth were internalized, allowing anticipation and comparison. The slow drift of stars, the recurring appearance of clusters, and the repetition of environmental patterns created a temporal scaffolding. This awareness enhanced memory, structured attention, and enabled prediction. Observation was no longer passive, it was dynamic, connecting past experience to present perception and future anticipation. The mind was beginning to perceive continuity, pattern, and cause and effect relationships across both temporal and spatial dimensions. Emotion and cognition were inseparable. The act of naming constellations was both functional and symbolic, reinforcing mastery and connection. Pride and joy coexisted with awe and humility, producing a rich emotional landscape that enhanced attention and reflection. Knowledge was embodied and meaningful. Observation, imagination, and emotion merged, creating an integrated experience of engagement with the cosmos. The child's mind navigated this interplay with sophistication, balancing personal insight with the vastness of the universe. By midnight, the constellations were fully internalized. Stars interacted dynamically in the mind, forming networks of narrative and relational significance. Patterns mirrored terrestrial life, social hierarchies, and abstract imagination. Observation, reflection, memory, and narrative construction were seamlessly intertwined. The night had become both laboratory and stage, where cognition, emotion, and imagination converged. The child's engagement exemplified the emergence of symbolic thought, reflective consciousness, and early philosophical awareness, demonstrating the human mind's capacity to structure, interpret, and narrate experience. As dawn approached, the child lingered, committing constellations, relationships, and stories to memory. The sky, once distant and indifferent, was now intimately known, named, and connected. This private act of observation and reflection, invisible to others, represented a monumental cognitive achievement, a synthesis of perception, imagination, and emotional engagement that laid the foundation for storytelling, philosophy, and cultural understanding. The constellations had become companions, guides, and frameworks for reflection, bridging the infinite cosmos and the human mind. Finally, as the first pale light crept across the horizon, the child retreated from the vantage point, carrying memory, insight, and narrative forward. Observation, naming, and imaginative connection had transformed both mind and experience. The constellations were internalized, dynamic, and meaningful, forming a cognitive universe integrating perception, emotion, reflection, and imagination. This quiet triumph, private yet monumental, marked another step in humanity's journey to understand, narrate, and find meaning in the cosmos, highlighting the profound interplay between observation, creativity, and philosophical thought. Night had fallen again, and with it came the familiar hush of anticipation. The tribe's fires glowed softly, casting dancing shadows across the clearing, while the forest breathed its nocturnal rhythm around them. Yet for the child, the ordinary sounds and sights of the night had become background to a deeper, more intricate experience. Every step toward the vantage point was measured, deliberate, as if approaching a sacred space. The stars above, once distant points of light, now waited like sentient witnesses, ready to reveal nuances that only careful observation could uncover. Each night's engagement was both continuation and discovery, a rhythm of memory, imagination, and reflection that shaped cognition with every glance. The constellations, now well internalized, were observed with an unprecedented depth. Stars formed networks that suggested movement, tension, and interaction. One cluster might pursue another, tracing a narrative of pursuit reminiscent of terrestrial hunting patterns. Another might suggest protection, echoing relationships and social hierarchies within the tribe. Through these mental constructs, the child's mind synthesized sensory perception, memory, narrative construction, and abstract reasoning into a seamless cognitive framework. Observation had become an act of creation, an intimate dialogue between mind and cosmos. Emotion remained a guiding force. Awe, pride, and quiet exhilaration mingled with humility before the vastness of the sky. Naming constellations was both assertion and acknowledgement, assertion of comprehension, acknowledgement of the universe's vast indifference. The act was transformative, connecting perception, cognition, and reflection in a deeply personal yet universally resonant experience. The stars were companions, teachers, and points of reference, each imbued with narrative, emotional weight, and conceptual significance. The balance of confidence and humility nurtured reflective thought and philosophical awareness, shaping the child's understanding of both self and cosmos. The relationship between terrestrial observation and celestial interpretation had grown more sophisticated. Patterns in nature, animal movements, seasonal cycles, and environmental cues, were mirrored in the constellations. A cluster might resemble the stealth of a hunting predator, while another traced arcs reminiscent of migration paths. Observation was not passive but deeply integrative, linking the immediate environment with imagination and abstraction. The child's mind had become a lens through which terrestrial and celestial realities were interwoven, producing a dynamic and nuanced understanding of the world. Social awareness remained a subtle, yet persistent, factor. Peers occasionally noticed gestures or intense focus, but comprehension remained limited. Adults, preoccupied with survival, were largely unaware. Nevertheless, the child's solitary engagement had broader implications, innovation, though initially private, was quietly preparing for cultural transmission. These experiences underscored the interplay between individual cognition and social context, foreshadowing the eventual emergence of collective storytelling, mentorship, and shared symbolic understanding. Observation was both a personal journey and a prelude to communal cognition. Imagination transformed perception into narrative. Stars moved in dynamic interactions, forming stories of pursuit, protection, and guidance. These narratives echoed terrestrial events, social dynamics, and emotional experience. The child's mental universe was now a tapestry where observation, abstraction, and emotional resonance were interwoven. Imagination was no longer mere embellishment, it was a tool for structuring understanding, facilitating memory, and fostering reflection. Each constellation carried practical, emotional, and symbolic meaning, demonstrating the emergence of sophisticated symbolic thought and early philosophical reasoning. Attention to detail sharpened progressively. Brightness, position, color, and subtle motion were catalogued and integrated into mental frameworks. Unexpected deviations prompted reflection, experimentation, and refinement of internal maps. Observation became recursive, blending memory, imagination, and analysis. The constellations were simultaneously fixed points and dynamic narratives, reference systems and imaginative constructs. The child's mind achieved a remarkable capacity for cognitive flexibility, integrating multiple dimensions of experience into a coherent mental model. Time was increasingly perceived as a structuring principle. Sequences, cycles, and rhythms in both sky and earth informed anticipation, comparison, and memory. The slow drift of stars, recurring appearance of clusters, and repetition of environmental patterns produced temporal scaffolding, enabling prediction and reflection. Observation was dynamic, linking past experience, present perception, and future anticipation. The mind's grasp of continuity, pattern, and cause and effect relationships was developing in both spatial and temporal dimensions, marking a critical stage in the evolution of human cognition. Emotion and cognition were inseparable. Naming constellations reinforced mastery while maintaining reverence. Pride and joy were tempered by awe and humility, producing a complex emotional landscape that enhanced attention, reflection, and retention. Knowledge was both practical and symbolic, embodied in perception, imagination, and reflection. Each constellation represented a synthesis of observation, narrative, and philosophical insight, merging intellect, emotion, and imagination into a holistic cognitive experience. By midnight, the constellations had become a fully integrated mental universe. Stars interacted dynamically, forming networks rich with narrative, symbolic meaning, and relational significance. Observation, reflection, memory, and narrative construction coalesced seamlessly. The night functioned as both laboratory and stage, cognition, emotion, and imagination converged to produce symbolic reasoning and reflective consciousness. The child's engagement exemplified the emergence of advanced cognitive processes, bridging sensory experience, abstraction, and storytelling, laying the groundwork for culture and philosophical reflection. As dawn approached, the child lingered, savoring the transition from night to day. Constellations, named, mapped, and internalized, were now companions, guides, and cognitive frameworks. The night had been a journey of observation, creation, reflection, and subtle social awareness. Knowledge, though invisible to the tribe, was profound in significance, a synthesis of perception, imagination, and emotional engagement that laid the foundation for human understanding, narrative, and philosophical exploration. The cosmos, once indifferent and distant, had been internalized, shaped, and understood through the child's mind. Finally, with the first pale light illuminating the horizon, the child withdrew from the vantage point, carrying the memory, narrative, and insight of the night. Observation, naming, and imaginative connection had transformed mind and perception. The constellations were internalized, dynamic, and meaningful, forming the foundation of a cognitive universe integrating perception, emotion, reflection, and imagination. This quiet triumph, private yet monumental, marked another step in humanity's enduring journey to understand, narrate, and find meaning in the cosmos, highlighting the interplay between observation, creativity, and philosophical thought. The 18th night arrived with an almost sacred stillness. The tribe's fires glimmered faintly, smoke rising in thin tendrils, while nocturnal creatures rustled in the surrounding forest. For the child, the night was both familiar and ever new, each star a constant companion, yet offering subtle variations that demanded careful attention. The mind had matured into a sophisticated observer, capable of integrating sensory input, memory, imagination, and emotional resonance into a seamless experience. Every glance, every trace of light, became an opportunity to refine understanding and deepen connection with the cosmos. The constellations were now fully internalized, their form stable in memory but dynamic in imagination. Stars interacted in stories and relationships, echoing terrestrial patterns observed during the day. A cluster might pursue another, reflecting predator-prey dynamics, while another suggested protection, guidance, or social hierarchy. These mental constructions were not arbitrary, they were grounded in observation, yet animated by imagination, producing a cognitive framework capable of integrating complex relationships, abstract thought, and symbolic reasoning. Observation had become a creative, interpretive act, bridging perception and meaning. Emotion continued to shape cognition. Pride, awe, and exhilaration were intertwined with humility and reverence for the vast, indifferent universe. Naming constellations was both a declaration of comprehension and an acknowledgement of limits. Stars were companions, teachers, and reference points, each imbued with narrative and symbolic significance. The delicate balance between mastery and humility nurtured reflective thought and philosophical awareness. The child's engagement was no longer merely observational, it was a profound dialogue with the cosmos, an intimate relationship between mind and universe. Terrestrial observation and celestial interpretation had become deeply integrated. Patterns in animal movement, the flow of rivers, seasonal changes, and environmental cues were mirrored in the constellations. A cluster might suggest the stealth of a predator, another the migration of herds. Observation was holistic, integrating perception, memory, imagination, and abstraction. The night sky had become a canvas upon which terrestrial patterns, social dynamics, and imaginative projection coalesced, producing a nuanced understanding of both Earth and cosmos. Social context continued to influence cognition subtly. Peers might notice gestures or intense focus, though they did not yet grasp the significance. Adults remained largely unaware. Yet these interactions hinted at the emergence of cultural transmission, individual innovation rippling outward to influence others over time. The child's solitary engagement was laying the foundation for storytelling, teaching, and communal knowledge. Observation was both private and socially contextualized, bridging personal cognition with eventual collective understanding. Imagination enriched perception. Stars were no longer fixed points, they moved dynamically in the mind's eye, forming stories of pursuit, protection, or guidance. These narratives mirrored terrestrial life, social structures, and emotional experience. Imagination was functional as well as creative, structuring understanding, facilitating memory, and supporting reflective thought. Each constellation carried layered meaning, blending practical insight, emotional resonance, and symbolic significance. The night sky had become both laboratory and theater, a space where cognition and imagination coalesced. Attention to detail sharpened further. Brightness, position, color, and subtle motion of stars were catalogued, analyzed, and incorporated into mental frameworks. Deviations from expected patterns prompted reflection and adjustment. Observation had become recursive, integrating memory, imagination, and analysis into a continuous cycle. The constellations were simultaneously fixed points and dynamic constructs, reference and narrative, demonstrating advanced cognitive flexibility. The child's mind had developed a sophisticated capacity for abstract thought, symbolic reasoning, and reflective engagement. Time emerged as a central organizing principle. Sequences, cycles, and rhythms in the sky reinforced understanding of temporal continuity. The slow drift of stars, recurring appearance of clusters, and repetition of environmental patterns provided scaffolding for anticipation, comparison, and reflection. Observation was dynamic, linking past experience, present perception, and future expectation. The mind now perceived continuity, pattern, and causal relationships across both spatial and temporal dimensions, forming a foundation for planning, higher-order cognition, and philosophical reasoning. Emotion and cognition were inseparable. Naming constellations was both functional and symbolic, reinforcing mastery while cultivating reverence. Pride and joy coexisted with humility and awe, producing a complex emotional landscape that enhanced attention and reflection. Knowledge was personal, embodied, and meaningful. Observation, imagination, and emotional engagement merged, producing a holistic cognitive experience in which stars were simultaneously objects of inquiry, narrative participants, and philosophical symbols. By the middle of the night, the constellations were fully animated in the child's mental universe. Stars interacted dynamically, forming networks of narrative and relational significance. Observation, reflection, memory, and narrative construction coalesced seamlessly. The night functioned as both laboratory and stage. Cognition, emotion, and imagination converged, producing early symbolic reasoning, reflective consciousness, and the foundation for philosophical thought. The child's engagement illustrated the human capacity to interpret, narrate, and find meaning in the universe, blending sensory perception, abstraction, and narrative creativity. As dawn approached, the child lingered, savoring the transition from night to day. Constellations, named, mapped, and internalized, were now companions, guides, and frameworks for understanding. The night had been a journey of creation, reflection, and subtle social awareness. Knowledge, though invisible to others, was profound in significance, a synthesis of perception, imagination, and emotional engagement that laid the foundation for storytelling, philosophy, and early cultural understanding. The cosmos, once distant and indifferent, had been internalized, shaped, and understood through the child's mind. Finally, as the first light of dawn brushed the horizon, the child retreated from the vantage point, carrying the memory, narrative, and insight of the night. Observation, naming, and imaginative connection had transformed mind and experience. Constellations were internalized, dynamic, and meaningful, forming a cognitive universe integrating perception, emotion, reflection, and imagination. This quiet yet monumental achievement marked another step in humanity's enduring journey to understand, narrate, and find meaning in the cosmos, demonstrating the profound interplay between observation, creativity, and philosophical reflection. Night enveloped the world once again, bringing with it the familiar stillness and anticipation that had become a rhythm in the child's life. The fires of the tribe glimmered softly, casting wavering shadows across the landscape, while the forest whispered with nocturnal movement. The child approached the vantage point with a quiet reverence, each step measured, mindful, as if entering a sacred space. The stars above shimmered in subtle constellations, some now familiar, others revealing minute changes that invited renewed observation. The child's mind had matured into a keen instrument of perception, memory, and imagination, ready to engage fully with the infinite expanse above. Constellations, internalized and dynamic, were observed with increasing depth. Stars formed complex networks, suggesting interaction, tension, and narrative. One cluster pursued another, reflecting patterns of predator-prey dynamics noted during the day. Another implied protection or guidance, echoing social hierarchies within the tribe and relational structures observed in family and peers. These mental connections were not static, they were fluid, integrating sensory perception, narrative construction, abstract reasoning, and imaginative projection. Observation had become an act of creation, where mind and cosmos engaged in a quiet dialogue. Emotion was inseparable from observation. Awe, pride, and quiet exhilaration intertwined with humility before the infinite and indifferent sky. Naming constellations was both assertion and acknowledgement, assertion of understanding, acknowledgement of limits. The stars had become companions, teachers, and points of reference, each imbued with narrative, symbolic meaning, and emotional resonance. This balance of mastery and humility cultivated reflective thought and philosophical awareness, deepening the child's connection to both cosmos and self. Terrestrial observation remained deeply intertwined with celestial interpretation. Patterns in nature, animal tracks, flowing rivers, and seasonal changes, were mirrored in the stars. A cluster might suggest the stealth of a predator, while another traced arcs evocative of migration paths. Observation had become integrative, blending sensory experience, memory, imagination, and abstraction. The night sky became a living map, bridging Earth and cosmos, providing a foundation for both practical understanding and imaginative exploration. Social dynamics subtly influenced cognition. Peers occasionally observed gestures or intense focus, though comprehension was limited. Adults remained largely unaware, preoccupied with survival. Nevertheless, the child's solitary engagement was already laying the groundwork for cultural transmission. Innovation, though initially private, began to ripple outward, foreshadowing the eventual emergence of storytelling, mentorship, and shared symbolic knowledge. Observation and reflection were thus personal and socially embedded, preparing the way for cultural continuity. Imagination transformed perception into narrative. Stars interacted dynamically in the mind, forming stories of pursuit, protection, and guidance. These narratives mirrored terrestrial life, social structures, and emotional experiences. Imagination was functional and creative, structuring understanding, supporting memory, and fostering reflection. Each constellation carried layered significance, integrating practical insight, emotional resonance, and symbolic meaning. The child's cognitive engagement with the night sky became an intricate tapestry of observation, abstraction, and philosophical thought. Attention to detail reached new heights. Brightness, position, color, and subtle motion were catalogued, analyzed, and synthesized into complex mental frameworks. Deviations prompted reflection, experimentation, and refinement. Observation became recursive, a continuous interaction between memory, imagination, and analysis. The constellations were simultaneously fixed points and dynamic constructs, reference and narrative, demonstrating advanced cognitive flexibility. The child's mind had developed the capacity for symbolic reasoning, abstraction, and reflective consciousness. Time emerged as an organizing principle. Sequences, cycles, and rhythms in the sky reinforced understanding of temporal continuity. The slow arc of stars, the recurring appearance of clusters, and repeated environmental patterns produced a temporal framework for anticipation, comparison, and reflection. Observation was dynamic, linking past experience, present perception, and future expectation. Continuity, pattern, and cause and effect relationships became intuitive, shaping planning, reflection, and higher-order cognition. Emotion and cognition were deeply integrated. Naming constellations reinforced mastery while cultivating reverence. Pride and joy were tempered by awe and humility, producing a complex emotional landscape that enhanced attention, reflection, and memory. Knowledge was both practical and symbolic, embodied in observation, imagination, and emotional engagement. Each constellation represented a synthesis of perception, narrative, and philosophical insight, demonstrating the emergence of sophisticated human cognition. By midnight, the constellations were fully alive in the child's mind. Stars interacted dynamically, forming networks rich with narrative, symbolic, and relational significance. Observation, reflection, memory, and narrative construction merged seamlessly. The night served as both laboratory and stage, where cognition, imagination, and emotion converged. The child's engagement exemplified symbolic reasoning, reflective thought, and the early emergence of philosophical awareness. Through these repeated nights of observation and imaginative engagement, the mind had achieved a sophisticated understanding of pattern, relationship, and meaning in both earthly and cosmic contexts. As dawn approached, the child lingered, savoring the transition from night to day. The constellations, now fully internalized, were companions, guides, and frameworks for reflection. The night had been a journey of observation, narrative construction, and subtle social awareness. Knowledge, though invisible to others, was profound, a synthesis of perception, imagination, and emotional engagement that laid the foundation for storytelling, philosophy, and cultural understanding. The cosmos, once indifferent and distant, had been internalized, shaped, and understood through the child's mind. Finally, as the first pale light touched the horizon, the child withdrew from the vantage point, carrying the memory, narrative, and insight of the night. Observation, naming, and imaginative connection had transformed mind and experience. The constellations were internalized, dynamic, and meaningful, forming the foundation of a cognitive universe integrating perception, emotion, reflection, and imagination. This quiet triumph, private yet monumental, marked another step in humanity's journey to understand, narrate, and find meaning in the cosmos, highlighting the profound interplay between observation, creativity, and philosophical reflection. The night had grown deeper, cloaking the world in quiet mystery. The fires of the tribe flickered softly, and the forest breathed a rhythm of nocturnal life. For the child, this night was both familiar and transformative, another step along the evolving journey of observation, reflection, and imaginative engagement. Each movement toward the vantage point was deliberate, almost ritualistic, a recognition of the sacredness of the stars above. Every twinkle, shift, and subtle interaction of light became a point of study, an invitation to deepen understanding and connect more fully with the cosmos. Constellations had become intricate networks of narrative, symbol, and relationship. Stars no longer existed in isolation, they were participants in complex stories, mirroring terrestrial dynamics observed during the day. One cluster might pursue another, recalling predator-prey interactions, while another suggested guidance, protection, or social hierarchy. These networks were dynamic, integrating observation, memory, imagination, and abstract reasoning into a cohesive mental framework. Observation was now an act of creation, where the child's mind engaged the cosmos in dialogue, shaping understanding while remaining attentive to its infinite complexity. Emotion continued to shape cognition. Awe, pride, and quiet exhilaration mingled with humility before the vast, indifferent universe. Naming constellations was both assertion and acknowledgement, a declaration of comprehension paired with recognition of limits. Stars were companions, guides, and reference points, each carrying narrative, symbolic, and emotional weight. The balance of mastery and reverence fostered reflective thought and philosophical awareness, grounding the child in both personal insight and universal context. This interplay of confidence and humility nurtured a mind capable of profound understanding and contemplation. Observation remained grounded in terrestrial experience. Patterns on Earth, animal movements, seasonal cycles, flowing rivers, were mirrored in the constellations. A cluster might suggest the stealth of a predator, another trace arcs reminiscent of migration paths. Observation had become holistic, integrating sensory perception, memory, imagination, and abstraction. The night sky had become a living, dynamic map, linking earthly experience with cosmic reflection and forming a bridge between practical knowledge and imaginative exploration. Social awareness continued to exert subtle influence. Peers occasionally noticed gestures, but comprehension was limited. Adults remained largely unaware. Yet the child's solitary engagement laid the foundation for cultural transmission. Innovation, initially private, began to ripple outward, preparing the way for storytelling, mentorship, and shared symbolic understanding. Observation and reflection were both personal and socially contextualized, demonstrating that solitary cognition could seed collective cultural growth. Imagination transformed perception into narrative. Stars were no longer static points of light, they moved dynamically in the mind's eye, forming stories of pursuit, protection, and guidance. These narratives echoed terrestrial life, social interactions, and emotional experience. Imagination became functional, structuring understanding, enhancing memory, and supporting reflective thought. Each constellation carried layered significance, integrating practical knowledge, emotional resonance, and symbolic meaning. The child's engagement with the night sky became an intricate tapestry of observation, abstraction, and philosophical reflection. Attention to detail sharpened. Brightness, position, color, and subtle motion were catalogued, analyzed, and integrated into mental frameworks. Deviations prompted reflection, experimentation, and refinement. Observation had become recursive, a continuous loop linking memory, imagination, and analysis. Constellations were simultaneously fixed points and dynamic narratives, reference and symbolic construct. The child's mind demonstrated advanced cognitive flexibility, integrating multiple dimensions of experience into a coherent and meaningful internal universe. Time emerged as a central organizing principle. Sequences, cycles, and rhythms in both sky and earth provided scaffolding for anticipation, comparison, and reflection. The slow drift of stars, recurring patterns, and repeated environmental phenomena reinforced continuity, pattern, and cause-and-effect relationships. Observation was dynamic, linking past experience, present perception, and future expectation. Temporal awareness supported planning, reflective thought, and abstract reasoning, marking a critical stage in the evolution of complex cognition. Emotion and cognition were inseparable. Naming constellations reinforced mastery while cultivating reverence. Pride and joy were tempered by awe and humility, producing a complex emotional landscape that enhanced attention, reflection, and memory. Knowledge was personal, embodied, and symbolic. Observation, imagination, and emotional engagement merged, producing a holistic cognitive experience in which stars served as objects of inquiry, participants in narrative, and symbols of philosophical meaning. By midnight, the constellations were fully animated in the child's mind. Stars interacted dynamically, forming networks rich with narrative, symbolic, and relational significance. Observation, reflection, memory, and storytelling merged seamlessly. The night became both laboratory and stage, where cognition, imagination, and emotion converged. The child's engagement exemplified symbolic reasoning, reflective consciousness, and the emergence of philosophical awareness. Through these repeated nights of attentive observation and imaginative projection, the mind had achieved a sophisticated understanding of pattern, relationship, and meaning in both terrestrial and cosmic contexts. As dawn approached, the child lingered, savoring the transition from night to day. Constellations, fully internalized, were companions, guides, and cognitive frameworks. The night had been a journey of observation, narrative construction, and subtle social awareness. Knowledge, though invisible to others, was profound, a synthesis of perception, imagination, and emotional engagement that laid the foundation for storytelling, philosophy, and cultural understanding. The cosmos, once distant and indifferent, had been internalized, interpreted, and connected through the child's mind. Finally, as the first light illuminated the horizon, the child withdrew from the vantage point, carrying memory, narrative, and insight from the night. Observation, naming, and imaginative connection had transformed both perception and cognition. Constellations were internalized, dynamic, and meaningful, forming a cognitive universe integrating observation, emotion, reflection, and imagination. This quiet yet monumental achievement marked another step in humanity's journey to understand, narrate, and find meaning in the cosmos, highlighting the profound interplay between observation, creativity, and philosophical thought. The first light of dawn spilled gently across the landscape, brushing the edges of trees and illuminating the sleeping forms of the tribe. Night's magic had faded into day, yet its echoes lingered in the mind of the child, who now stood at the familiar vantage point one last time before retreating to the warmth and bustle of the village. The sky, though dimmed by early light, retained a sense of vastness and possibility. Every star previously traced, every constellation named and internalized, had left an indelible imprint on the child's consciousness. This moment was not merely the end of another night's observation, it was the culmination of a journey, an exploration of perception, imagination, memory, and reflection that would forever shape how the world was understood. Throughout countless nights, the child had built a mental universe, connecting points of light into networks rich with narrative and symbolic meaning. Stars interacted in intricate stories of pursuit, guidance, protection, and reflection, mirroring terrestrial life while expanding into imaginative abstraction. Observation had become an art and a science, integrating sensory experience, memory, imagination, and reasoning into a cohesive and dynamic cognitive framework. The constellations were no longer just patterns in the night sky, they were companions, teachers, guides, and reflections of both the natural and social world. Each connection held practical, emotional, and philosophical significance. Emotion had been the quiet guide, shaping attention and deepening understanding. Awe, wonder, pride, and humility had woven together to create a complex emotional landscape, where knowledge and reverence coexisted. Naming the stars was both an act of mastery and an act of respect, asserting understanding while recognizing the boundless mysteries that remained. The child had experienced the profound human realization that knowledge is not ownership of the universe but a dialogue with it, an engagement that inspires both insight and humility. In this delicate balance, the seeds of reflective consciousness and philosophical thought were nurtured. Terrestrial observation had informed celestial understanding. Patterns in animal movement, seasonal shifts, and environmental cues were mirrored in the constellations, producing a deep integration of practical knowledge with symbolic meaning. The child's mind had learned to bridge earth and sky, creating a synthesis that transformed isolated perception into a comprehensive, meaningful understanding. Constellations were simultaneously tools for survival, frameworks for reflection, and canvases for imagination. Observation, therefore, was never passive, it was an act of creation, a dynamic interplay between the mind and the cosmos. Social context subtly framed the child's engagement. Peers had occasionally observed gestures of focus, though comprehension was limited. Adults remained largely unaware, absorbed in survival tasks. Yet this solitary practice of observation and reflection was laying the groundwork for cultural continuity. Knowledge, though initially private, would eventually ripple outward into the community. The child's cognitive achievements foreshadowed the emergence of storytelling, mentorship, and symbolic transmission that would define human cultural evolution. Observation and reflection were thus both personal journeys and foundational contributions to collective knowledge. Imagination transformed perception into narrative. Stars moved dynamically in the child's mind, forming stories of interaction, pursuit, protection, and guidance. These narratives mirrored terrestrial patterns and social relationships, enriching understanding and emotional insight. Imagination was not merely decorative but functional, organizing information, supporting memory, and fostering abstract reasoning. Each constellation carried layers of meaning, practical, emotional, and philosophical, merging observation, reflection, and creativity into an integrated cognitive experience. Attention to detail had reached a refined precision. Brightness, position, subtle motion, and the relationships between stars were catalogued, analyzed, and integrated into mental frameworks. Deviations prompted reflection, hypothesis, and refinement. Observation had become recursive and deeply analytical, blending memory, imagination, and reasoning into a seamless cognitive process. Constellations functioned as reference points, narrative threads, and symbolic constructs, demonstrating advanced cognitive flexibility and the emergence of abstract thought. The child's mind had developed the capacity to navigate complexity, integrate multi-layered information, and reflect philosophically. Time had become an organizing principle. Cycles, sequences, and rhythms in both sky and earth provided scaffolding for anticipation, reflection, and understanding. The predictable arcs of stars, the recurring emergence of clusters, and the repetition of environmental phenomena offered a temporal framework to interpret change, causality, and continuity. Observation now incorporated past, present, and future, linking memory, perception, and expectation. This understanding of time fostered higher-order cognition, planning, and the ability to perceive broader patterns in both natural and social contexts. Emotion and cognition were inseparable in this final stage of the journey. Naming constellations reinforced mastery while cultivating reverence. Pride and joy coexisted with awe and humility, enhancing attention, reflection, and memory. Knowledge was deeply personal yet connected to universal principles. Observation, imagination, and emotion merged to produce a holistic experience, where stars served simultaneously as objects of study, narrative participants, and philosophical symbols. The night sky had become a mirror of the child's mind, reflecting both internal thought and external observation. By the final hours of night, the constellations had been fully internalized. Stars interacted in mental networks, forming narratives that blended terrestrial patterns, social insight, and imaginative abstraction. Observation, reflection, memory, and narrative construction had converged into a sophisticated cognitive universe. The night functioned as both laboratory and stage. The child's mind engaged dynamically with the cosmos, blending analytic precision, imaginative projection, and emotional resonance. This engagement exemplified the emergence of symbolic reasoning, reflective consciousness, and early philosophical thought. As dawn broke, the child lingered, savoring the transition from night to day. Constellations, named, mapped, and internalized, were companions and cognitive frameworks. The journey of observation, naming, and imaginative engagement had cultivated a mind capable of profound understanding and philosophical reflection. Knowledge, though initially invisible to others, had been internalized in a form that would shape thought, culture, and narrative for years to come. The cosmos, once distant and unknowable, had been bridged by perception, imagination, and insight, revealing the enduring human capacity to interpret, narrate, and find meaning in the universe. Finally, as the first rays of sunlight bathed the landscape, the child turned from the vantage point, carrying memory, narrative, and insight forward into the waking world. Observation, naming, and imaginative engagement had transformed both perception and cognition. Constellations were internalized, dynamic, and meaningful, forming the foundation of a cognitive universe integrating observation, emotion, reflection, and imagination. This quiet yet monumental achievement marked the culmination of a journey, the synthesis of experience, and the enduring human impulse to understand, narrate, and connect with the cosmos. The child's journey had become timeless, a reflection of humanity's eternal quest to make sense of the universe. Through repeated nights of observation, reflection, and imagination, a cognitive universe had been created, one in which stars were no longer distant points of light but companions, guides, and symbols of meaning. Knowledge, emotion, and philosophical awareness had merged, forming the foundation of culture, storytelling, and human consciousness. The night sky, once vast and incomprehensible, had been internalized, understood, and transformed into a source of insight, wonder, and reflection. In this final moment, the child's story, though solitary, represented a universal human experience, the relentless drive to observe, interpret, imagine, and reflect. The constellations were more than stars, they were milestones of understanding, markers of cognitive evolution, and beacons of philosophical insight. This journey, from curiosity to mastery, from observation to imagination, from solitary reflection to cultural significance, was the story of the mind reaching toward the infinite, naming the stars, and finding its place within the cosmos.